Why do you seem so scared? All I wanted to do was play with you. Please come and play with me. I am so lonely. You're not afraid of the dark, are you? Don't be afraid. Come with me. I will show you where I play hide and seek. Do you want to play hide and seek? You hide, and I'll find you.
Dennis Nilsen was a Scottish serial killer and necrophile. He murdered 12 young men and boys. What leads a man down this path? It goes without saying that Nilsen was a troubled person. His troubles began when he was only 5 years old, in 1951. October 31st, Dennis came home from a day at kindergarten to find the mood at home to be very grim. His mother had been crying in the living room. Dennis asked her, "What is it, Mummy?" She said, "Grandpa's here." This was confusing to Dennis. Andrew's presence in the house was always a joyous occasion. He assumed she meant he had returned from a fishing expedition, which was always a good thing. Not this time. Betty said, "Come, let us go to Grandpa." They went into the kitchen. Andrew lay in a wooden coffin on their very large kitchen table. Dennis ran to him, crying, "Grandpa, Grandpa!" Betty shushed him, saying, "Grandpa is sleeping, Dennis." He was not taught about the finite timetable of life, but he could tell by changes in Andrew's appearance that he wasn't going to wake from the so-called sleep. His face was pallid and swollen. His lips had become purple. His mouth was half open. He wasn't breathing. Dennis grilled his mother about the sleep. She finally told him he had gone to a better place. Dennis wanted to understand why his grandfather didn't take him to that place. 3 days later, the day of the funeral, Dennis's brother Olaf and his friends told Dennis that Andrew died of a heart attack while at sea. They proceeded to explain to Dennis the difference between life and death, sparing no graphic details. Only an autopsy would have been more specific. Though Dennis understood death now, he still found it difficult to cope with the fact that his grandfather was not only gone, but could never return. Years later, Dennis would describe Andrew's death as the most traumatic event of his life. He said that the funeral was the event at which his conceptions of love and death became inextricably intertwined, misinterpreted and distorted, bound for mutation in the years to come. Following his grandfather's death, Dennis became introverted. He never opened up to adults, and seldom did so with children his own age. Sylvia was his only confidant, but he didn't share his feelings with her on a regular basis. In his spare time, he would go to the harbor to watch the fishing trawlers offload their haul for the day. During the summer, he would go for a swim in the ocean by himself. One day when he was 9 years old, death came knocking for the second time in his life. He went swimming in the sea and nearly drowned. He felt the breeze from the Grim Reaper's scythe as it missed him by millimeters. A teenage boy heard his cries for help and pulled him to the surface. Not only was this memory to stay with Dennis because he came so close to dying, but there was something about the physical contact the older boy made with him that was noteworthy. He fixated on the boy's strong hands and soft body touching him all over as he was brought back to shore. In fact, he couldn't stop thinking about it. He began to grow up quickly after that day. He started to explore his own body. His brush with death activated his sexual awakening. Once again, sex and death were inseparable in Dennis's mind. By the time he turned 12, he was masturbating regularly. One summer day in 1957, his family had a picnic in the countryside. When everybody got home, they were exhausted and went to bed early. That is, everybody except Dennis. He just couldn't fall asleep. Later, he went to the kitchen to have a glass of milk. He noticed that the door to Olav's room was ajar. He listened to hear for any other sounds in the house that were typical of sleep. Satisfied that everybody else was unconscious, he went into Olav's room. He tiptoed across the carpet and knelt down beside Olav's bed. He pulled the blankets aside. He slowly slid his hand into his brother's pajama pants. He felt his penis. He played with it for a few minutes. Having finished with this, he stood. His heart was pounding. By the time he returned to his bedroom, the crotch of his pajama bottoms was soaked with semen. He now knew he was homosexual. Dennis's life changed in 1957. His mother remarried. Dennis didn't like her new husband. They moved to a town called Stryken. One evening, the three children were alone while their mother and stepfather went out to eat. A friend of Olav's came over after the parents left. Unlike Dennis, Olav was popular in school and had plenty of friends. Dennis was envious and couldn't understand why he was so poorly received by his peers. He didn't even have one close friend among the outcasts. Most of his friends were of the imaginary sort. They were boys with lean, tall, and smooth bodies. Ultimately, these friendships came with imaginary benefits. Olav made an announcement to Dennis and their sister Sylvia. "We're leaving. There is a bonfire party at the beach for older children. We'll be back before Mom and the slave driver gets home." Dennis said, "You can't. Mom said we must both look after Sylvie." Olav's friend said, "Why is he such a bitch?" Olav said, "Because he is the little hen in the house, not Sylvie over there." Not only was this remark humiliating to Dennis, but he felt violated as well. He realized Olav knew about his secret. He had gone to great lengths to hide his homosexuality from the rest of the world. The way it felt now, Olav might as well have held a press conference to announce it on the BBC. Dennis knew the truth of his sexuality, but he also experienced a great deal of shame about it. This was the 1950s after all. He was also struggling to cope with the onset of puberty, which was stressful in its own right. He became terrified that Olav would tell everybody at school that he was gay. That evening he was alone with Sylvia. He fondled her in a desperate attempt to cure himself of his homosexual impulses. It didn't work. He told Sylvia it was important that boys and girls explore each other. She complied, removing her clothes and allowing him to explore her body. The more he touched her, the more his inclination to do so diminished. It disappeared altogether. Throughout the next 4 years, Betty was frequently pregnant. She had 4 more children. The house was becoming crowded, and Dennis was miserable. They lived in poverty. There was very little in the way of recreation in the town of Stryken. The closest beach was 20 miles away. His stepfather was contemptible toward him. He also felt that his mother was too attentive to the younger children. He felt neglected. He wanted to leave. At the age of 15, Dennis Nilsen decided to join the army. He was desperate to escape his mother and stepfather's house, and the military offered a career and a salary, making the transition to adult life much easier. Betty protested, saying he was too young to join. However, during the year in question, 1961, the United Kingdom's army was accepting recruits who were younger than 18. She realized her argument didn't have a leg to stand on. She and her husband didn't have much to offer Dennis. They couldn't afford to send him to university or trade school. She asked him, "Which division are you planning on joining, son?" He smiled and said, "The catering corps. I'm going to become an army chef. That is my goal. I will get free board and lodging, and they pay good wages." Betty was relieved that he wasn't going to die on the battlefield. However sincere he was in making these claims, the truth was that he was more driven to escape his life than to serve his country. Off to the army he went. He began his training with the Army Catering Corps in Aldershot, England. The subsequent 3 years were the happiest of his life. Though he hated the rigorous physical training, he relished the camaraderie at the barracks. Everybody was friendly toward him and accepted him as he was. Nobody rejected him like his brother's friends did in school. Some of his military colleagues considered him a bit odd, but they never ridiculed him. He did demonstrate some proclivities that were contrary to the tastes of his contemporaries. While they listened to the Beatles and the Rolling Stones, he listened to classical music like Beethoven, Bach, Vivaldi, and Mozart. His friends read Parade and other pop culture periodicals. He read poetry and began to write his own. He took to writing prose as well. He kept his homosexuality a secret from his military colleagues. It was still legal for gays to enlist in the military at that point in British history. Dennis shied away from using the communal open shower facilities. He would bathe alone in one of the enclosed adjoining bathrooms. The reason for this was that he feared he would become erect while showering with all the naked men in the room. He also preferred the lavatory because he could masturbate without being discovered. While still living in Aldershot, he bought an expensive camera with his first paycheck. He took up the pursuit of photography with enthusiasm. This way he could live out some of his fantasies while minimizing risk. Late at night, before lights out, he would gather some of his fellow recruits and say, "All right, boys, we're going to do a battle scene." The men thought it was a strange idea, but it got boring in the barracks at that time of night, so they didn't see any harm in it. "You two," he said, "on the floor with your arms above your head. You've been slain in battle." A third man asked, "What about me?" Dennis said, "Sit against the foot of this bed. Put your rifle's barrel in your mouth. You committed suicide because you couldn't handle the gruesomeness of the war anymore." Dennis would take photos of these tableaus. After they were developed, he would take them into the bathroom and use them to arouse himself before masturbating. He delighted in these activities. July 1964. Dennis passed his catering exam. He was assigned to the 1st Battalion of Royal Fusiliers in Osnabrück, West Germany. It was there where he started smoking cigarettes and drinking alcohol. He would drink to excess almost every night until he passed out. He was less bashful about his sexual orientation while drunk. He would hang from the necks of his colleagues and allow them to hug him. They would carry him to bed when he was too inebriated to stand. Occasionally he pretended to be passed out in hopes that somebody would initiate sexual contact, but it never happened, much to his disappointment. 2 years later he was returned to Aldershot. He was then deployed to Norway and then Yemen. In Yemen, he had his own room on the compound. There was an antique shop nearby. Dennis bought 2 items that fueled his sexual fantasies: a freestanding mirror and an oil-painted reproduction of The Raft of the Medusa by Theodore Géricault. The painting depicted survivors of a shipwreck. Dennis's undivided attention was focused on the bottom left-hand corner. An old man sat on the edge of the raft with the naked body of a dead young man in his lap. Beside them was a dead man with the lower half of his body severed and lying elsewhere. Dennis positioned the painting and the mirror beside the bed so that the lower half of his body was visible in the mirror. He would look back and forth from the mirror to the painting, and vice versa. From the naked dead man in the painting to his own nude body, squirming as it was. He imagined himself having anal sex with another male. This became a daily ritual carried out every day in the afternoon following lunch. 2 months later, he finally got to realize one of his sexual fantasies. He befriended a young Arab man, and their alliance soon led to sexual intimacy, in which they engaged frequently. He enjoyed popularity at the base because he became an accomplished chef with his culinary repertoire enjoyed by all. Not all his memories from Yemen were good. One night after a session of heavy drinking, he hailed a taxi. After getting in, he was hit over the head with a hard object. He passed out. When he woke, he was in the trunk of the car. When it stopped, he pretended to be asleep as the man dragged him out of the car. When he was halfway out, he grabbed a jack handle from the floor of the trunk and knocked the taxi driver to the ground. He beat him to a pulp. He locked the man in the trunk and hitchhiked back to the base. He never heard anything about the taxi driver's fate. Dennis was sent back to the United Kingdom. From there he was transferred to Cyprus and then back to Germany. One day in Berlin he hired a prostitute and had his first sexual encounter with a woman. Though he bragged about it to his military colleagues, inwardly he regarded the experience as boring, depressing, and overrated. It didn't arouse or fulfill him nearly as much as his fantasies about passive and vulnerable males. He spent many occasions during his last 3 years in the army traveling throughout Scotland. He took many photos, some of the landscape and some of soldiers playing dead. October 1972. Dennis got into a violent altercation with his roommate. He was dishonorably discharged from the army. He told his family he resigned, claiming he was opposed to the practice of shooting unarmed civilians during a protest march on Bloody Sunday in Derry, Northern Ireland. Olav was skeptical. Dennis became idle at home, leading to his mother asking, "When are you going to get a job, Dennis?" He had been living at home for a month. He said, "I'm thinking of going to London to join the police force, Ma." The conversation shifted to a darker tone from there. "Betty, and why are you so hopeless at getting a girlfriend? You were 27 years old, for God's sake." Olav, "Because he's a bloody faggot." Dennis's face flushed with embarrassment. He was astonished and hurt that his brother would say such a thing. "Betty, a what?" Olav, "A faggot, Ma, a queer. He likes boys instead of girls." Betty, "Oh my, is that true, Dennis?" Dennis pushed his plate aside. He stood up and said, "Thanks for the food." He went to the lounge to smoke a cigarette. He was enraged at Olav. This experience followed the previous evening when they watched a movie called Victim, which was about the discovery of a plot to blackmail gay men in 1960s London. Olav and his wife declared that they hated homosexuals. Dennis took this personally. He and Olav had a brawl after the movie. Now Olav told his mother straight out about his sexuality, and he did so with vulgarity and spite. Dennis could easily picture himself strangling Olav with his bare hands. A week later, Dennis moved to London and began his training at the Metropolitan Police Academy. April 1973. Dennis completed his training and started working as a junior constable. He was outfitted with free accommodations at the police section house. With no rent to pay, he spent all his income on clothing, food, and alcohol. He took to his position as police officer with efficiency and gusto during the day. At night, he became a casually dressed, quote, "seeker of attractive men," end quote. His timing couldn't have been better. Because of the rock band Queen and its frontman Freddie Mercury, the gay scene in London changed dramatically. There were now hundreds of gay pubs, and homosexuality lost its taboo status. Dennis reveled in this and had numerous sexual encounters with the men he met at gay establishments. These did not provide him with any kind of lasting fulfillment. He felt lonely and yearned for a long-term connection, leading to a relationship. December 1973. Dennis was racked with guilt. The gay men who engaged in sexual activity in public spaces were committing a crime, but Dennis couldn't bring himself to arrest them. He resigned from the police force. He began working as a security guard. For months, he was homeless, since he wasn't able to stay at the police section house anymore. He stayed in hostels and rented rooms. Dennis was bored with his security job. He found something better that didn't employ him on a contractual basis. A position as a civil servant in May 1974. He worked for Manpower Services. His task was to search for employment for unskilled laborers. He continued to frequent gay bars in this free time. November 1975. One night, Dennis scared off two men who were harassing a young man. The young man's appearance was notable. He had blonde hair and a bob, soft facial features, fake silver earrings, and pink lipstick on his mouth. He was softly spoken. He had a friendly and honest look in his eyes. They struck up a conversation. Dennis, what's your name? Young man, David Gallican. They shook hands. Dennis, hello David, I'm Dennis Nilsen. David, Nilsen, is that Norwegian? Dennis, yep, though I'm actually Scottish. My biological father came from Norway, but I was born in a small town called Fraserburgh in Scotland. I never really knew my real father, you know. David, same here. Dennis, do you have a place to sleep tonight? David shook his head. Dennis, shame. You must be cold and starving. David, that's the understatement of the week. Dennis, well, Twinkle, why don't you come back to my place? I will feed you, and you can borrow some of my dry clothes. What do you say about that? David, I'd like that very much. At Dennis's home, David was given food, dry clothes, and beer. Later, they sat down on the couch. Dennis placed his hand on David's thigh. They conversed some more. Dennis, you're unemployed, aren't you, Twinkle? David, I am looking for a job, but, yes, currently I'm living on the dole. I stay at youth hostels whenever they have space available. Dennis, well, you can stay here just as long as you need to, at least until you get a job, that is. David, you're a very kind man. What do you do for a living? Dennis, that's sort of ironic. I'm in unemployment administration. A civil servant, if you like. Dennis reached into his pocket for a pack of cigarettes. Dennis, smoke? David, no thanks. They spent the rest of the night talking, drinking, and listening to music. The next day, after breakfast, Dennis said to David, I like you very much, Twinkle. Would you like to move into a bigger apartment with me? David said, I would love to. The rest of the day found them looking at rental ads in the newspaper, meeting with real estate agents, and visiting properties. A week later, they moved into a new apartment in Cricklewood. Over the next few months, they were ensconced in domestic bliss, engaging in home improvements, and enjoying their relationship. Regarding their relationship, Dennis never fell in love with David. It was more of a friends with benefits arrangement than a full-out romantic relationship. Dennis was drinking more often and in larger quantities. In his drunken stupors, he would often talk to himself instead of David. Their relationship began to deteriorate. He became frustrated with David because he tried to inculcate in him an appreciation of filmmaking and the photographic process. He bought an 8mm film camera. His enthusiasm was not infectious enough for David. David didn't listen to his instructions and simply just didn't share his passion for the pursuit. Dennis and David began to fight regularly. Dennis was incensed that David went out to gay bars and had dalliances with other men. At one point, Dennis threw David out. The last 6 months of 1978 was a dark time in Dennis Nilsen's life. With David gone, he slid into a bender. So frequently drunk, he staggered into a downward spiral. His life followed a bleak and lockstep pattern of work, drinking, sex, and sleep. The three things he loved most were caring for his dog, Bleep, cooking, and listening to music. When he took Bleep for walks, he would often take his 8mm film camera with him. He would film young men walking around or having lunch in the park. Dennis felt that Bleep was the only being, besides his grandfather, who truly loved him. Otherwise, he felt defeated and lonely. He picked up many men and brought them to his place. He had a good time with them, and some of them visited more than once. They found his alcoholism and depression off-putting and usually abandoned him as a result. Dennis still missed David, but he also realized he wasn't suited to a long-term relationship. It occurred to him that he was impossible to live with, and this made him feel even worse. He eventually went to the pubs less and less often. He would drink by himself at home in the evenings. He resumed his routine of masturbating in the mirror, as he had done in Yemen. He was usually drunk as he did so. This time he added a new dimension to the experience. He would apply heavy makeup to his face. He would darken his eyes, whiten his face, and color his lips purple. He did this to make himself look as much like a corpse as possible. He would follow up by masturbating to his reflection, pretending he was having sex with a dead man. By late 1978, he was 33 years old and living a solitary existence. His place of employment offered the only social interactions he would experience at this point. His drinking affected his attendance record, but he would work overtime to make up for the deficiencies in his performance. He was still regarded as a trustworthy employee and committed to fighting unemployment. One of the perks of his position was that it enabled him to study the behavior of London's unemployed male population. Dennis hoped that his career would be a catch-all that he could use to pull his life together. Unfortunately, the bottle anchored him to a much less productive existence. During his drunken stupors, he would become delusional and paranoid. December 30th, 1978. For the first time in months, Dennis was craving sexual congress. He drank 3 glasses of rum and coke alone at home. London was abuzz. The eve of New Year's Eve was drawing near, and thousands of tourists took to the streets. Those same streets were blasting music from pubs and nightclubs. Dennis went to a pub called Cricklewood Arms, which was near his apartment. He was in high spirits, something that hadn't occurred in a long time. He was determined to get lucky. He took a seat on a bar stool and nursed a beer. He was about to engage in some chit-chat with the bartender when a young man that caught his fancy walked in. He walked up to the space beside Dennis and ordered 2 drinks in a thick Irish accent. He looked like he was 17 or 18 years old, according to Dennis's estimation. He was way off. The boy was 14. He was an early bloomer. His name was Stephen Holmes. The following exchange occurred. Bartender, can I see some ID? Stephen, don't have it on me. Bartender, then I can't serve you. Sorry, fella. Dennis, come on now, give the young man a break. It's the holiday season for Pete's sake. What's your name? Stephen. Stephen. Dennis. By the looks of it, Stephen over here is about 18, so what do you say, Mr. Bartender? Bartender. Nah, he doesn't look a day older than 16 to me. Dennis. How old are you? Stephen. What's it to you? Dennis. Look, I'm only trying to help, okay? Dennis liked Stephen's feisty attitude. He was developing an erection. Stephen pocketed his money and announced he would buy his booze elsewhere. As he made his exit out of the pub, Dennis grabbed his arm. He said, "Wait, come sit down. I have a proposition for you." The boy sat down next to him with some trepidation. Dennis held out his hand. "My name is Dennis, but you can call me Des, okay?" Stephen shook his hand and gave him a slight nod. He said, "What's the proposition?" Dennis said, "Well, it seems like you have a dilemma, young Stephen. Now, I don't know how old you are, and I don't really care. However, I like your attitude, and if you are willing to come back to my place down the road to keep me company, I will give you some rum and coke to drink. I have a shitload of the stuff." Stephen's disposition changed immediately. He grew radiant. He said, "I love rum and coke." Dennis shushed him and said, "We do not want any of the other people to know about our plans now, do we?" Once at Dennis's apartment, they had drinks and listened to music. Dennis didn't want to scare the young man off by making a move too early in the evening. The problem he was faced with later on was that they were both so inebriated they could barely stand straight. Dennis was desperate to have sex with Stephen, but he was flaccid. The closest they came to having sex was undressing while laughing and stumbling around. They crash-landed on the bed and fell asleep soon after. In the morning, Dennis woke just after 7. Stephen was still sleeping in the nude. After taking some aspirin to treat his hangover, Dennis stared at Stephen. He broke out in a cold sweat. He was worried Stephen would want to leave after waking. He didn't want him to leave. The tie he was wearing the night before hung around the bedpost. He realized by looking at it that he didn't have to go to work that day. Manpower Services was closed on New Year's Eve. Dennis slowly pulled the tie down. He thought to himself, "I want to celebrate the new year with you, young Stephen, whether you want me to or not." He was desperate to keep Stephen there. He didn't want to lose him like he did David and all his one-night stands. Stephen slept on his stomach with his head facing the side of the room. Dennis slowly sat upright and tried to control his labored breathing. With his right hand, he slipped the thin end of the tie underneath Stephen's throat. He was very careful to avoid waking him. He pulled the tie upward with his left hand on the other side. Stephen stirred when the tie grazed his Adam's apple. He went back to sleeping. Dennis held both ends of the tie in his hands. He tightened his grip. He began to pull and squeeze with all his strength. Stephen woke from the pressure around his throat. The only sound he could make was a muffled gurgle. Dennis straddled him and planted his knees onto Stephen's back. Stephen's hands and knees thrashed to and fro. Dennis squeezed tighter for another 2 minutes. Stephen made gurgling and snorting noises. A few more minutes of this and he went limp beneath Dennis's knees. Exerting that much control and domination over this boy he wanted so much was exhilarating for Dennis. An adrenaline rush overtook him. He didn't know his own strength. He let go of the tie. He threw his head back, panting for air. It was an exciting sensation for him. He observed that while Stephen was unconscious, he was still breathing. Dennis got up and went to the kitchen. He grabbed a medium-sized plastic bucket he normally used to bathe Bleep. He filled the bucket with cold water. He returned to the bedroom. Stephen was still unconscious and motionless. Dennis placed the bucket on the floor. He repositioned Stephen's body so that it hung above the bucket. He grabbed Stephen by his hair and pushed his head down into the water. He held it there. Small bubbles appeared at the surface. He waited for them to peter out. Stephen went into convulsions for a moment. Then they stopped. He was dead. By contrast, Dennis hadn't felt this alive in a long time. His heart was pounding. His mind raged to life with a storm of images. Images of dead bodies. His dead grandfather. Corpses of soldiers in Yemen. The naked dead man in the raft of the Medusa. And now, the nude body of Stephen Holmes. He lived fast, died young, and left a good-looking corpse. Now, with his legs splayed over the bed and his torso perched over the side, he was even more vulnerable. Vulnerability was a fetish for Dennis Nilsen. Dennis surveyed what he had wrought, and he felt a tinge of regret. He made short work of that last vestige of remorse. He said to Stephen's corpse, "Let's see if you can leave my apartment now, you son of a bitch." Later, after having a cup of coffee, a few cigarettes, and taking Bleep for a walk, Dennis returned to Stephen's cadaver. It had been an hour since he died. He arranged the body into a horizontal position. It lay upside down across the bed. He spread his legs. Dennis was overwhelmed by how aroused he became. Logic and morals didn't enter into this. His crotch became the locus of his existence for the time being. He bent down and fondled Stephen's testicles. Dennis's erection bore into his jeans with so much force, it was painful. Dennis tore his jeans off. He straddled Stephen's body. He pushed his penis into the crack of Stephen's anus. He slid his penis over the crevice for 9 seconds. This is all it took for him to have an orgasm. He blasted Stephen's back with a stream of semen. He rolled off Stephen's dead body and collapsed onto the bed. He had never felt this much satisfaction. A dreamy smile appeared on his face as he closed his eyes. This was a significant turning point in his life. There was no going back now. 3 hours later, Dennis said to Stephen's corpse, "Let's get you cleaned up, sweetie." Dennis got to his feet. He hoisted Stephen's body to his shoulders and carried him to the bathroom. Once there, he placed his corpse on the floor. Dennis ran a hot bath while perched on the side of the tub. He considered what to do next. He was amazed by his ability to remain calm in a situation like this. It occurred to him that the right thing to do was to turn himself into the police. He wanted to see first if anybody reported Stephen missing. Once the bath was ready, he dunked Stephen's corpse into it. The corpse grazed against his penis as he pushed it into the tub. His erection returned. He decided to focus on the task at hand, and he soon became flaccid. He washed the body strenuously, starting at the feet. He worked his way up, shampooing the hair and wiping his pale face with a washcloth. When he was satisfied with how clean the body was, he placed a towel on the floor. He struggled to lift it out of the tub and onto the towel. It was dead weight after all. He dried Stephen with a second towel. He went to the lounge to take up Stephen's jeans and shirt. When he returned to the bathroom, he propped the body up against the bathtub. He said to Stephen's corpse, "Come on, darling, let's get you dressed. I think it's going to be a cold day." He struggled to get the corpse back into Stephen's clothes. Once he was finished, he carried it back to the bed and tucked it in, as if he were a child at bedtime. Dennis retrieved Bleep from the backyard. He took a seat in the living room. He drank a rum and coke to take the edge off. He turned on the radio, waiting for a news report. From where he sat, he could see the corpse under the covers in the bedroom. He noticed that Stephen's feet were sticking out from the covers. Bleep was licking the toes. He shouted, "Bleep!" He jumped up from the chair. "This has nothing to do with you. Out!" Dennis went into the bedroom. He said to Stephen's corpse, "Sorry about that, Stevie." He covered Stephen's feet with one of his jackets. There was no mention of Stephen in the news reports. Dennis nodded at the screen, satisfied. He assumed that Stephen was homeless and that nobody would care if he went missing. He decided to ring in the new year with Stephen's corpse. He would dedicate the morning of New Year's Day to disposing of the body. He asked himself, "How do I get rid of the body?" He couldn't dump it in some rural location because he didn't own a car. He kept reassuring himself that everything was going to be okay. He spent most of the afternoon drinking rum and running through all the possibilities of how he could dispose of Stephen's remains. He drank until he became drowsy. He took his pants off. He climbed into the bed with the corpse. He undressed it. He was too drunk to achieve an erection, so he played with its genitalia until he passed out just after 7 p.m. Dennis Nilsen spent the opening seconds of 1979 drunk and unconscious with a naked corpse at his side. In the morning, he celebrated the first day of 1979 by having sex with Stephen Holmes's corpse and decorating it with his ejaculate. Dennis rolled the corpse onto him, arranging him into the missionary position. He proceeded to thrust his erect penis between Stephen's thighs. Rigor mortis had set in, and they were stiff. He had an orgasm in seconds. After he was spent, he pushed the cold cadaver off his torso. An unexpected feeling of disgust washed over him. Logic pierced the membrane of delusion that shielded him from moral considerations. It suddenly occurred to him that it was insanely dysfunctional to kill someone and have sex with their carcass. Nevertheless, he simply could not help himself. After a few minutes of staring at the floorboards, where they skirted up against the southern wall of the room, he came up with an idea that would enable him to hide the body without attracting attention from outsiders. He wiped his semen from the legs of the corpse with a paper towel. He moved the furniture in the living room to the kitchen. He rolled up the carpet in the lounge. He lifted 3 of the floorboards with a chisel. The air beneath the floorboards was clammy and covered in cobwebs. Beyond that was 18 inches of vertical space. It was enough to conceal a body. He dragged the body over and placed it beneath the floorboards. He put Stephen's hands over his chest. This was the way Dennis's grandfather was buried. He put the floorboards back in place and covered it with the carpet. He thought to himself, "Now we will be together forever." Having finished with this task, he stood back and dusted off his hands. He said, "Sweet dreams, Stevie." He put all the furniture back. He built a small fire in the backyard in which he burned Stephen's clothes. He rewarded himself for his efforts with a glass of rum. No Coke. At 9:12 a.m. A week later, he became curious as to how decomposed Stephen's body was. He thought, "Poor Stevie, I need to check on you, make sure you're all right." He exhumed the body that evening. To his surprise, it changed very little, aside from having become very dirty. The skin transitioned from ivory white to bluish gray. He was bloated, but he still looked like a human being. There was no foul odor. Dennis got undressed. He hugged Stephen's cold body. He carried it to the bathroom for another hot bath. He viewed Stephen as one of his most valuable possessions, and he always took care of his possessions. He bathed the corpse as rigorously as before. He clipped the fingernails. Once it was dry, he powdered the face. When he buried the corpse again, he wrapped it in dustbin liners so that it wouldn't become dirty again. After burying Stephen Holmes for the second time, Dennis resumed his life as if nothing unusual had happened. He went to work and did all the things he normally did. He just happened to have a corpse underneath the floorboards now. He had the companionship he always sought in living beings, but was unable to find. Things were looking up in other ways. He was promoted at work. Something was rotten in Denmark, however. To be more precise, something was rotten and stinking up Dennis Nilsen's apartment in London. It was a scorching London summer, hotter than most, and the stench of decaying human flesh permeated the air in Dennis's flat. He went about his daily ablutions with a scarf over his nose and mouth. He may have been a murderer and a necrophile, but even his stomach could not endure the smell of death. Bleep became highly agitated. It was too much for him to bear. He had to get rid of that stench. He built a fire in the backyard. The walls around the yard were too high for his neighbors to see what was burning. He also had to conceal the smell from the decomposing corpse as it was burning. His solution was to dump soil he used to plant flowers onto the fire pit. When he added the body of Stephen Holmes to the pyre, he said to his corpse, "Have a good afterlife, Stevie. May you never encounter someone as evil as me wherever you're going next." As the black smoke wafted up in the air and the adipose tissue of Stephen's body crackled and burst, Dennis cracked a smile. Dennis added a tire to the fire, which further disguised the stench of burning flesh. December 3rd, 1979. It was a work day, and Dennis went to a pub during his meal break. A man in his early 20s sat near him. He was studying a map of London. He was deep in concentration. Dennis changed his location, sitting on the bar stool next to the man. He said, "You not from around here?" The young man looked up. "Huh? Oh, I'm sorry you startled me there." "Dennis, are you a tourist or something?" Young man, "Sort of." The young man extended a hand. They shook. Young man, Kenneth Ockenden." Dennis, "Nice to meet you, Kenneth. I'm Dennis Nilsen." "Ockenden, are you from Norway, Sweden?" Kenneth, "No, actually, I'm all the way from Canada. I'm a student there." Dennis, "So, Mr. Canadian, what brings you to this part of the world?" Dennis offered a cigarette, but Kenneth declined. Kenneth, "I visited some relatives in Carshalton after touring the Lake District in the Northwest last week, and now I am making a quick stop in central London before I'm going back to Canada for Christmas with my parents." Dennis, "I see. Well, you were speaking to the right man, Ken. I know this shithole of a city like the back of my hand. No need for that map." Kenneth, "Really? I've never been here in my life. I mean, I saw Big Ben from afar earlier, but other than that, I don't know any of the tourist attractions." They talked about London for an hour. They had another round of beers. Dennis glanced at his watch. It was now 3 p.m. He should have returned to work a couple hours ago. Dennis, "Well, it's almost 3 o'clock. It will be a waste of time for me to return to the office now. What do you say I take you on a quick tour of central London, young lad?" Kenneth, "That would be wonderful. Tell me something. What do you do for a living, anyway? You seem to know an awful lot about the city's administration." Dennis, "Oh, I'm a civil servant. I work in the unemployment sector. A rather boring job, I have to say. I fill out forms and stamp them. Then I fill out more forms and stamp them, too." Kenneth, "Let's go, then." The two men went to London's most famous landmarks and tourist attractions. Unlike David Gallican, Kenneth Ockenden was passionate about photography. He took several snapshots. As the city-wide gallivanting drew to a close, Dennis invited Kenneth to have dinner with him at his apartment. His gaydar concluded that Kenneth wasn't homosexual, but Dennis still enjoyed his companionship. He said, "I'll tell you some more about the history of London, and I have a superb record collection. We can listen to music and perhaps go out for another drink later." Kenneth was game. Kenneth enjoyed listening to Dennis talk. He considered him to be wise, and he hung on his every word. Bleep liked Kenneth immediately and sat on his lap while Dennis prepared the meal in the kitchen. Kenneth felt very comfortable and welcome in Dennis Nilsen's lair. He trusted him and feared nothing. He said to Dennis, "So I see you guys have a female prime minister now. What do you think of her?" Dennis, "I like her, Ken. I think she is going to be staunch and she will sort out Britain's fiscal problems. She's already talking about introducing a series of economic policies intended to reverse the high unemployment figures." Kenneth, "Fair enough, but will she have the balls to implement them?" Dennis, "That woman has bigger balls than yours and mine together." Kenneth could smell the meal Dennis was cooking. Kenneth, "That smells delicious. What are you making?" Dennis, "It's a surprise. I hope you're hungry." Kenneth, "Starving." After a light meal of egg quiche with ham and fries, the men decided not to go out to a pub for drinks. They went to an off-license to buy whiskey, rum, and beer. After returning, they listened to music until well after midnight. Dennis, When are you going back to Canada, Kenny? Kenneth was very drunk. He swayed his head back and forth. He slurred his words. Kenneth, tomorrow night. This was a shock to Dennis's system. Not only was Kenneth planning on deserting him, but he wouldn't even be in the same continent 24 hours later. The muted remarks Dennis wanted to make to Kenneth in protest rushed through his mind. Tomorrow? No, you can't. I'm just getting to know you. You can't go away tomorrow, Kenny. You have to stay here with me, damn it. Dennis, that's a pity. I was just beginning to enjoy your company. Kenneth, same here. Dennis played the album Who Are You by The Who. He queued up a song called Sister Disco. Dennis, listen, Kenny, this song's stereo is amazing, but you have to listen to it through the headphones. They were sitting on the carpet in front of the turntable. Dennis gave the headphones to Kenneth after plugging them in. Kenneth put them on and hummed to the music. Dennis's blood was boiling. He was apoplectic that Kenneth was going to leave him the following day. He rose to his feet. He grabbed the headphones cord and wound it around Kenneth's throat. He strangled him with it. Nilsen's face turned red as he pulled tighter and tighter. He started shouting, saying, "Give me back the headphones, Kenny. I also want to listen to the song." Kenneth was too inebriated to resist. Dennis started dragging Kenneth around the floor, the cord pressing into his neck like a vice grip. After 4 minutes of this, Kenneth perished. Dennis Nilsen's body count was now at 2. Dennis unraveled the cord from Kenneth's neck. He plugged them in again. He poured himself some rum and listened to the rest of the songs on side A. He listened to the music on side B. After finishing the album and the glass of rum, he performed the bathing ritual on Kenneth's body. After cleaning it to his satisfaction, he brought it to bed and fondled Kenneth's genitals until he fell asleep. In the morning, Dennis had to report to work. He shoved Kenneth's corpse into a cupboard. On his way out, he noticed Kenneth's camera. He was still keen on photography, only this time there would be no artificial tableaus of mortality. This time he could document a real dead man with photographs. He picked up the camera and examined it. He was disappointed to discover that all the film had been exposed. Dennis returned from work at 5 o'clock. On his way home, he purchased a Polaroid camera. He wasn't about to be so reckless as to take photos of a naked corpse and have them developed by outsiders. After returning home and getting settled, he retrieved Kenneth's corpse from the cupboard. He took photos of his body in sexually provocative positions. He was pleased with the quality of the images. Dennis dressed the corpse in Kenneth's tracksuit. He propped him up in an armchair that faced the television. Dennis poured himself a rum and coke. He sat next to the corpse and watched TV. This time the 6 o'clock news was more relevant to Dennis's situation. The anchor said, and in international news, a student from Canada went missing in London between yesterday and today, after he had been visiting England for a tour of 3 weeks. 23-year-old Kenneth Ockenden was last seen in the Southampton area 2 days ago, before he traveled to London by train. His parents became suspicious when they didn't hear anything from their son in over 24 hours. Ockenden was supposed to check into a flight from London to Ontario at 5 o'clock this afternoon. If anyone has seen this man, please contact Scotland Yard on 20-7230-1212. A black and white photo of Kenneth was displayed on the screen. Dennis said, "Holy crap, Kenny, look at that. They are searching for you, dude." The morbid humor gave way to anxiety. It suddenly occurred to Dennis that somebody may have seen them together the previous day. They did meet at a pub, after all. He had a panic attack. It had nothing to do with remorse. He was frightened of spending the rest of his life in prison. After giving it more thought, he came to this conclusion. If push comes to shove, I will just burn the body on a bonfire like I did with Stevie. Dennis watched television for another 45 minutes. Following this, he got up and disrobed the cadaver. He wrapped it in plastic dustbin liner bags. He stowed Kenneth underneath the floorboards, as he had done with Stephen Holmes. During the next 2 weeks, Dennis masturbated twice a day to the Polaroids of Kenneth's dead and decaying flesh. He drooled at the visage. On 4 occasions, the purely visual stimuli was not sufficient. He needed it to be tactile. He would exhume Kenneth's corpse. He would masturbate and ejaculate over the cadaver. Afterwards, he would bathe the corpse again. After drying it off, he would put his pajamas on the body and put it on the armchair, so Kenneth could watch television with him. He would happily drink rum and have conversations with Kenneth's remains for hours before putting it back under the floorboards. While watching the show Chips, he would say to Kenneth in reference to the character Frank Poncherello, "What do you think of that hottie, Ken? I think he is sexy, but not nearly as sexy as you." Dennis wasn't so deranged that he expected Kenneth to answer him, but he enjoyed these lopsided exchanges nonetheless. One evening, Margaret Thatcher gave a speech on television. Dennis said to Kenneth's lifeless body, "What did I tell you, Kenny? Listen to that woman. She's got bigger balls than both of ours together. Bugger me." After watching television with Kenneth's dead body, he would undress it once more before wrapping it in plastic bags and burying it under the floorboards. He would courteously wish it adieu. "Good night, Kenneth." Dennis saw Kenneth as the perfect roommate. Attractive, silent, still, and passive. When he dug out the corpse for the 4th time, a sour odor filled the air. He no longer watched television with Kenneth. Dennis told his employer that he was sick with the flu. This enabled him to stay home from work from December 18th until Christmas Eve. This sabbatical was extended into an annual leave until the early days of 1980. He devoted this period to a bender. His drinking was worse than it had been in a long time. He nearly drank himself to death for 2 weeks. The pleasure the murders and necrophilia brought him receded, giving way to a mortifying self-assessment. He finally accepted that he had a sick mind. He needed psychiatric help, and he knew it. Instead of consulting with a mental health professional, he clung to the bottle. Exactly 1 year later, from New Year's Eve 1978, the opening moments of 1980, had Dennis Nilsen passed out alone in his apartment from a drunken stupor, his only companion, a dead body. May 16th, 1980. Dennis Nilsen attended a labor union conference. The next day, he commuted back home on the train. When he returned to London, he walked out to Euston Square and happened to notice a young man panhandling near the trolley station. The young man said to Dennis, "Please, sir, do you perhaps have a pound to spare for a bread and a carton of milk? I haven't eaten in days." Dennis cast no doubts on the boy's integrity. He was gaunt and shivering from the cold, despite the fact that it was a mild spring day. His clothes were filthy, his hair was ruffled, and there was a bewildered look in his eyes. This young man was desperately in need of sustenance and a giving hand. In other words, he was vulnerable. "Dennis, what is your name, lad?" The boy. "Martin Duffy, sir." "Dennis, please stop calling me sir. How old are you, Mr. Duffy?" "Martin, I'm 16, sir." "Dennis, Martin, do you have a place where you can overnight?" "Martin, no, sir." "Dennis, then come with me. Let us get you cleaned up, and then I'll put some food into your belly." Martin conveyed his gratitude. He followed Dennis to a taxi. When they arrived at the apartment, Dennis directed Martin to the bathroom. He gave him a towel and a bar of soap. After Martin was dispatched to the lavatory, Dennis went to the floorboards to check for any offensive odors that may have befouled the atmosphere. Satisfied that this was not the case, he put a pot of pasta on the stove. While the pasta was boiling, he went to the bathroom door. He peeked through the keyhole. He arrived just in time to see Martin remove his briefs and get into the bath. He was pleased with how youthful Martin's body was. It reminded him of his brother Olav when he'd play with his penis. Dennis grabbed his crotch as he became erect when Martin turned around, revealing his buttocks. Dennis swallowed hard. He thought to himself, "Tonight your ass is mine, Martin Duffy." 10 minutes later, Martin was clean and attired in one of Dennis's t-shirts and a pair of shorts. He sat at the kitchen table. Dennis was preparing the meal wearing only a vest and boxer shorts. He initiated a conversation. "Dennis, how did you end up living at the railway station?" This was a tragic detail of Martin's life. He dropped his chin to his chest. "Martin, I'm a runaway. I used to be a catering student in Birkenhead, but that decision was forced upon me by my parents. Catering is not what I want to do for the rest of my life, so I quit and took the train here 4 days ago. But I didn't have any money for the train fare, and the transport police caught me out, so I was thrown off the train at Chester. From there I hitchhiked here, and then spent 3 days at the station until you found me this afternoon." Dennis, "Bloody hell, where did you sleep?" Martin, "On one of the benches behind Euston Square." Dennis, "That must have been tough and lonely." Martin, "It was. Sir, please don't call up my parents. Please, please. They don't know where I am, and I don't want to go back to Birkenhead." Dennis, "Your secret is safe with me, Martin. I don't even know who your parents are, or what their phone number is. Right now, my only responsibility as a civil servant is to make sure you're fed and that you have a roof over your head." Martin, "You're a civil servant? What, like an officer of the law?" Dennis, No, I work for Manpower Services. I help obtaining employment for people like you. That is why you are going to stay here for the rest of the weekend, and on Monday we're going to find a job somewhere, okay?" Martin, "Okay, thank you so much. You're like an angel." Dennis served the meal. Martin thanked him and ate ravenously. Martin was so undernourished, his movements were sluggish. Dennis, "Do you like the food?" Martin, "It's fantastic. Where did you learn to cook like this?" Dennis, "I was a chef in the army. Traveled all over the world while learning new recipes." They ate in silence for a while. When they finished, Dennis stood and patted Martin on his shoulder. He said, "Why don't you lie down on the bed? I can see that you are dead tired." Martin could hardly disagree. He said, "You're right. I'm out on my feet. Thank you for the food." Martin went to the bed and fell asleep in a couple of minutes. Initially, Dennis truly wanted to find Martin a job in the coming week, but as he stood staring at the boy as he slept in his bed, he realized that a golden opportunity stared him in the face, and it was one he might not stumble upon any time in the near future. Dennis paced back and forth for a half hour. He took decisive action. He grabbed his necktie from where it hung over a chair. He twisted it into a ligature. Once it was tight as a rope, he rushed to the bed. He wrapped the tie around Martin's neck and strangled him with all his strength. Duffy woke and tried to scream. All he could do was gurgle and rasp. He aggressively kicked his legs. He tried to wedge his fingertips between the tie and his neck. Dennis overpowered him. Dennis held his grip until Martin's limbs went limp. Martin was unconscious. Dennis dragged him into the kitchen by his feet. He left him on the floor as he filled the sink with water. He became aroused at the thought of having a second dead roommate to defile. Dennis thought to himself, "Three's company, Kenny." He was so hard, his erection poked out through the hole in his boxers. Once the sink was half full, Dennis hooked his forearms underneath Martin's armpits from behind. He pushed his head into the water and drowned him. Assured that Martin was dead, Dennis undressed him and placed him on the floor in the supine position. Dennis removed his own clothes. He straddled Martin's body, sitting on the upper legs. He enfolded his erect penis with Martin's flaccid member. He rubbed vigorously. Dennis climaxed in seconds. He ejaculated on the corpse, covering the stomach and rib cage. He said to Martin's corpse, "You are so beautiful." He bent down and kissed his lips. He stuck his tongue in Martin's mouth. Dennis stood and attempted to pick up Martin's body. He couldn't. He was spent. Having become devoid of energy, the best he could do was to drag the body to the bathroom, maladroit as he was. While the bath was running, he prepared a rum and coke for himself. This was a new bathing ritual. He got into the tub with the corpse this time. He sponged the semen from Martin's torso with soap and water. He sang to the corpse, "You are my sunshine, my only sunshine. You make me happy when skies are gray." Dennis felt like he was in love this time. He didn't understand how it could be possible, but he was. After the bath and another round of masturbation, he finished his drink. He put the corpse back into his bed and got settled. Martin's remains were stored in the same cupboard where Kenneth Ockenden had been kept. He was stored there for 2 days. Once his body became too bloated, Dennis placed it under the floorboards next to the corpse of Kenneth Ockenden's, which was severely decomposed and mutilated. Just before Dennis replaced the floorboards, he was struck with guilt. It occurred to him as he stared at Martin's swollen face that his parents may be worried about him. Dennis said to himself, "Perhaps I should choose the older ones, like Ken. At least the ones that are not minors anymore." He never could dispense with the consideration he had for how the victims' families may have felt. He became increasingly disturbed. He began to regard himself as a psychopath obsessed with surrounding himself with dead bodies. No matter how much this fact rattled him, there was no way for him to change. He was driven to kill these young men because of deep feelings of loneliness and a fear of abandonment. This was the kind of thing that sent him into lengthy drinking benders that nearly killed him. The remorse Nilsen felt on occasion was not enough to quell his desire for more companions of the expired variety. His appetite for more dead flesh was like an empty stomach with a tapeworm, feeding and starving without cessation. August 20th, 1980. Nilsen attended a stage play. Afterwards, he went to a pub. He sat down at a table and ordered a drink. He sized up the other patrons. Most of them sat in groups, but he spotted one attractive man in his late 20s sitting alone at the bar. He was wearing a tight-fitting pink t-shirt. He had a muscular physique, and his arms were bedecked with tattoos. His hair was jet black. He had a dark complexion. He reminded Dennis of Poncherello. He considered approaching him. Having become sufficiently inebriated, he now had the confidence to sidle up to the man. He had a cigarette hanging from his mouth. He tapped the man on the shoulder and said, "Excuse me, do you have a light for me?" The man smiled and said, "Be my guest," in a Scottish accent. He pushed a box of matches over to Dennis. Dennis thanked him. He lit the cigarette and took a seat. The man said, "Will you watch my stuff for a second? I need to take a pee." Dennis said, "Sure." While the man went to the washroom, Dennis opened his wallet to have a look at his identification. His name was William David Sutherland, and his date of birth was May 5th, 1954. Dennis thought to himself, 26, a full-grown man, like Ken Ockenden. That is much better than the two young ones. Having defiled Stevie and Martin led him to wonder if he was a pedophile. This ate away at him. William Sutherland returned. "William, thank you. I'm Billy, by the way." "Hello, Billy. My name is Dennis. You don't mind the company?" Billy, "Not at all. Where are you from? You sound Scottish." Dennis, "Yep, Scottish all right. I'm originally from Aberdeenshire, but I've been living in London for almost 10 years now. You? Billy. Edinburgh. That's where I was born, but I'm actually all over the place now. I guess you can call me a gypsy of some sorts. Billy wasn't just a gypsy, he was also a prostitute. He had no fixed address and never stayed in one town or city for more than 3 or 4 weeks at a time. He had little education or formal occupational training. He eked his way through a life by having sex with desperate gay men who were willing to pay. He supplemented his income by pickpocketing commuters at underground railway stations. As Dennis and Billy got to know each other, Billy was totally open about the life he was living. He even tried to solicit Dennis. Dennis refused. He told Billy that paying for sex was something he would never do. The refusal didn't lead to any tensions between them, however. Dennis told Billy about his military experiences, and Billy told Dennis some of the tales of his adventures as a transient. Billy, you meet strange people in some of these places. This one time I was in Cardiff, and there was a Welshman who paid me £50 to act dead while he masturbated over my body. Can you believe that? Dennis, interesting. Dennis took a drag from his cigarette as a shiver ran down his spine. The hairs on the back of his neck stood up. Billy, interesting? No, that is not interesting, my friend. That is just plain fucked up, if you ask me. I mean, really? Dennis, so, what is the weather like in Wales? Billy, pretty much the same as here, only they actually have real summers. Between June and August, you sometimes get as much as 15 days of sunshine in a row. Dennis, bollocks. Billy, I shit you not. During the summertime in Wales, people are tanning on the bonnets of their bloody cars, man. Just before 8:30, they finish their drinks and decide to visit other establishments in and around Piccadilly Circus. After a few hours of pub crawling, Dennis became tired. He said, "Listen, Billy, it was great hanging out with you, but I have to get into bed. Tomorrow's a work day for me, see?" Billy was sad to hear this, but accepted it, and they parted. Moments later, Dennis was in line at a tube station, where he felt a pat on his back. He was startled. He turned around. It was Billy. Billy said, "Look, Dennis, I have nowhere else to go. Take me back to your place, please?" He brushed up against Dennis. "I'm willing to sleep with you without expecting any payment, but I'm really broke after all the drinks. Will you at least pay for my tube ticket?" 20 minutes later, Dennis and Billy were at the apartment. They were kissing and tearing each other's clothes off. They adjourned to the bedroom. Dennis performed oral sex on his guest until Billy climaxed. Dennis tried to initiate anal sex, but his erection was not hard enough to enter. At first, he chalked it up to all the alcohol he imbibed. Then something else struck him. Billy was too animated. He was absolutely teeming with life. This would not do. Dennis said, "Lay still, otherwise this is not going to work." Billy said, "I can't. I'm really sorry, but I have to take another pee. Just give me 2 minutes, okay?" Billy got up and went to the bathroom. Dennis was frustrated. It was the 10th time Billy went to urinate in the 4 hours since he met him. Dennis climbed out of bed slowly, careful to avoid making noise. He saw that Billy didn't close the bathroom door. He was so drunk, he was swaying back and forth. He missed the toilet and pissed on the floor. Dennis thought to himself, "This guy is twice as drunk as I am. That cancels out his advantage of physical strength over me." Dennis had only been drinking beer. Billy had been drinking straight whiskey. Dennis bent down and quietly removed his belt. He made a lasso out of it and approached Billy from behind, tiptoeing all the way. Just as Billy was shaking off, Dennis slipped the looped belt over his head and tightened it around his neck. By the time Billy realized what was happening, the belt was cutting into the flesh of his neck with so much force he could barely breathe. His muscles were contracting out of panic. His heart was pounding as he felt the life being squeezed out of him. As he gasped desperately for air, his lips turned purple. His nose started bleeding. Dennis kicked his heels against the toilet. He groaned. He ripped the belt backward with extreme force. Billy's neck snapped with a sharp, audible crack. Billy collapsed to the floor. He was dead. Dennis glared at his naked body, laying on the floor as it was. He crouched down to see if he still had a pulse. He did not. He was relieved. Moments later, Dennis was in bed with Billy's corpse. He sodomized Billy while pulling the belt around his neck with both hands. He watched it on a mirror. He panted while saying, "Yes, my Billy boy, that's how Des likes it. That's exactly how Des likes it." Sweat poured in torrents down Dennis's back. The arousal was overwhelming, and Dennis had 2 orgasms in quick succession. He followed up this encounter with a bathing ritual that was customary by now. He wrapped Billy in plastic bags afterwards and stored it beneath the floorboards, where he was far from lonely. Dennis Nilsen's corpse collection now stood at 3 specimens. September 1980. Billy Sutherland's remains were still fresh enough for television, bathing, and sex. It was a completely different story with Kenneth Ockenden and Martin Duffy, who had been stored underneath the floorboards for 8 months and 4 months, respectively. They were now attracting vermin. Their carcasses were teeming with maggots. When Dennis opened the floorboards to take Billy out to watch TV with him, he nearly vomited when he saw the maggots and flies crawling out of the ears, eye sockets, and nostrils of the older corpses. The entire apartment was infested with flies by this point. The foul stench of decaying flesh saturated the air. No amount of insecticide sprayed under the floorboards and in the living room was sufficient to cure the atmosphere of the stink. It was repugnant. The corpses were now more of a burden than a source of amusement. He used deodorants and perfumes to disguise the odor and get rid of the flies and maggots, but this was no more effective than anything else. As he stared down at the floorboards, he said to himself, "This is becoming a clusterfuck." He simply could not keep the corpses in the house any longer. He came up with the idea of tossing the bodies into a large bonfire in his backyard. Before doing this, he returned to the opening in the floorboards, this time with garbage bags and an electric carving knife. He knelt and laid out some of the bags like a blanket. He plugged the knife in. He dragged Kenneth's corpse up onto the bags. He cut off his head. He severed his limbs. He cut the torso in half as an avalanche of maggots spilled to the floor. He removed Kenneth's heart. It was shrunken and shriveled, having been emptied of all blood. He set it aside on a clean dustbin liner. He placed the rest of his body parts in another bag. He repeated the procedure on the corpse of Martin Duffy. He kept Martin's heart as well. This operation took 2 hours. During that time, Dennis ran to the bathroom to vomit 5 times. He had a hard time keeping Bleep away from the mess of badly decomposed human remains. He had to lock her in the bathroom. Billy Sutherland's body was harder to dismember. The process of decomposition was in its infancy, so the flesh was still tough. It was still stuck to the bones. It was difficult to pry it loose. Dennis went to the kitchen and returned with a large meat cleaver. As he chopped Billy's corpse into pieces, he thought of the butchering of pigs and cows he did as a chef in the army. Billy couldn't have been dead for more than 10 days by that point. Dennis thought, about a week shy of well-matured beef. After he had cut all 3 corpses into sizes he deemed manageable, he put them in the trash bags. He hauled them out to the backyard. He burned some tires with dry leaves and wood. Once the fire was burning high, he threw the body part-filled bags on top of the flames. Psychologically, he felt freer than he had in a long time. He was ready for a fresh start now that his house was clean. 4 hours later, the fire petered out. Dennis went back inside and took up the 3 hearts he kept, which were stored in a dustbin liner. He poured himself some rum. He buried the hearts in a corner of his garden. After covering up the hole, he said to the hearts, "Cheers, here's to Ken, Martin, and Billy. May your hearts forever be at peace, fellows." Dennis called in sick to work, claiming to have the measles. He was absent for 16 days. He drank himself into oblivion every night. Mostly he drank at home, but sometimes he drank at a pub. Voices in his head were talking to him, telling him he was an evil murderer, and that his condition could never be cured. Not in a million years. October 1980. One morning, Dennis woke up next to the naked corpse of a pretty blonde-haired man in his mid-20s. He couldn't remember anything from the previous night. How and where they met, how they ended up on his bed, how he killed him. He drew a blank. Dennis's first order of business was to place the man underneath the floorboards as soon as possible. He was not aroused and felt no emotional attachment to him. The corpse's very presence was repellent to him. The silver lining was that this event convinced him that he needed to dial back his drinking. He was only able to enjoy his last 4 murders because he was sober enough to remember what transpired before he killed them. He asked himself, what is the point in killing someone if you cannot recall anything the next day? Where's the fun in that? November 1980. After a fruitless night at a pub, Dennis Nilsen was on his way home when he spotted a vagrant sleeping underneath a blanket of newspapers. It was very cold. Dennis approached the man. The man woke and muttered incoherently. He was very thin and pallid. He was shivering. Some of his teeth were missing. Dennis said, "Hey, what is your name?" The man turned his back to him and became silent. Dennis said, "Look, I just want to help you." Dennis crouched down. "It's bloody cold outside, man. Let me take you back to my place and give you something to eat and a bed to sleep in. Do you have any identification on you?" The man shook his head. He started to weep. Dennis helped him up. He hailed a taxi. They were silent throughout their commute, but once inside Dennis's apartment, the man said, "Thank you very much for your kindness." He sat on the floor in the living room. He played with Bleep while Dennis prepared a meal in the kitchen. Dennis gave him some food and 2 bottles of beer. He tucked him into bed an hour later. Dennis poured himself a whiskey nightcap and sat down to watch the television. The Shining was on, and Dennis was so taken with Jack Nicholson's performance, he began to consider killing the man in his bed. Still, he truly wanted to care for the man. He also knew that he would eventually regret killing him. By the time the end credits of The Shining rolled, Dennis had leapt on the vagrant and strangled him with a necktie. Apart from swinging his legs around in a cycling motion, the man died fast and with little other fanfare 3 minutes later. The moment the man's heart stopped beating, Dennis was beset with remorse. He was angry with himself. He was also angry at The Shining, which ignited the homicidal impulse within him, or at least that's what he thought. He did something that, given his track record, was practically unfathomable. He made an attempt at resuscitating his victim with mouth-to-mouth breathing. It was all in vain. Dennis began to cry uncontrollably. He said, I'm so sorry, to the man's corpse. Afterwards, Dennis looked at himself in the mirror. He spat at his own image. He said to himself, why did you do that, you sick bastard? Why? He was just a homeless man, damn it. That wasn't necessary, Des, not at all. After burying the man's body underneath the floorboards, he tried to draw comfort from the fact that he spared the man another day of his wretched existence. As Dennis said to himself, his life as a nomad on the streets of London would have turned out one of long suffering anyway. January 4th, 1981. Dennis met a man he referred to as Blue-Eyed Scotty. The man was 18 years old. He'd met him at the Golden Lion. He became Dennis's 7th victim. Physically, this murder was the most difficult. Nilsen was so inebriated he could barely hold on to the necktie's ends as he strangled the man in the armchair in the living room. They played a drinking game called I Have Never. Scotty described the game to Dennis. Scotty: It's quite easy. I start with something like, I have never masturbated on a train. Then you need to ask yourself whether you have ever done that. If the answer is no, I drink, and it's your turn. But if the answer is yes, you have to down your drink, and I get to go again. Dennis: That sounds like fun. Dennis outfitted them with a bottle of tequila and 2 shot glasses. They were already drunk from happy hour at the pub. They planned on passing out at Dennis's apartment anyway, so they had nothing to lose. Dennis: Off you go then. Scotty: I have never tried to suck my own you-know-what. Dennis: Damn you. Next question. Scotty: I have never slept with a woman. Dennis: Really? Scotty: I thought you said you were gay. Dennis: I am. It only happened once when I was still in the army. It was an experiment of some sorts, but not a very pleasant one. Scotty: Okay, here's the next one. I have never had sex in public. Dennis: Drink up, my friend. I'm afraid I haven't had the privilege. Scotty: All right, your turn again. Dennis: I have never masturbated on a train. Drink up, buddy. Scotty: Bugger. You caught me with my own example. Dennis: I have never had a threesome. Scotty: I have never had sex with a guy in his sleep. Dennis: I have never had sex with a boy younger than 18. Scotty: I have never engaged in bondage games. As if on cue, Dennis Nilsen ripped off his tie and strangled Scotty until he wrung out every last breath. It took an excess of 15 minutes. He was so drunk he lost his grip on the tie several times. His strength diminished to the point where he began to doubt his ability to complete the task. Scotty cried out in a raspy voice, "What the hell are you doing to me?" He kicked his legs against the base of the chair. He was shielding his face with his arms. Ultimately, his reflexes failed him, and he stopped breathing once Dennis made a knot in the tie and managed to hold it tenaciously for a long time. Dennis let go of the necktie and slumped to the floor. Bleep licked his hands as if it were Dennis who was the victim. Dennis said, "Oh Bleep, why can't I stop this?" He rolled onto his back. He thought about the words that set him off. Bondage games. He reflected on an incident that happened in October 1979. He met a homosexual student from Hong Kong named Andrew Ho at a pub. When Andrew went back to his apartment with him, Dennis tried to strangle him. Andrew managed to escape from the strangulation. He reported Dennis to the police the next day. The police questioned Dennis, but Andrew decided not to press charges. He told them they were just playing bondage games. Dennis never heard from Andrew Ho again. Dennis got himself together and dragged Scotty's body to the living room. He buried him beneath the floorboards. Before putting the floorboards back into position, he wept as he inspected the damage he had done. He was so distraught, he neglected to put the floorboards back into place. He was a mess. March 29th, 1981. Nilsen went to a pub for a meal and several pints. In his inebriated state, he picked up a gay Irishman. He couldn't pronounce the man's name properly, so he referred to him as Belfast Boy. They went to his apartment. As it was early in the afternoon, they took a nap together to sleep off their drunkenness. Dennis woke at dusk. He turned to Belfast Boy. He was dead. Dennis had no recollection of how this came to be. The voices in his head had a very clear idea of what transpired. He strangled the man with his bare hands. This was confirmed as he smarted from pain in his wrists and thumbs. When Dennis pried open the floorboards, he realized there was a new problem to contend with. There was no space down there for a fourth body. He said, "For fuck's sakes." He carried Belfast Boy to the kitchen and stored him in a cabinet under the sink. He took up his electric carving knife, a roll of garbage bags, and returned to the opening in the floorboards. Bleep was sniffing the area excitedly. He locked her outside. Dennis dragged out all 3 decaying corpses, one by one. He dissected them into smaller pieces. He stored them in the plastic bags, heads, arms, legs, and sections of the torsos. He worked well into the night. He took 4 breaks, 2 for vomiting, 2 for smoking. When he finished, he noticed there was now room for Belfast Boy's body underneath the floorboards. He wouldn't fit as a cohesive unit, however. He had to dismember him too. After packaging all 4 corpses, the floorboards were put in place. Dennis had a long bath and let Bleep back in. He had butchered all his other companions. He was all alone again. July 29th, 1981. Dennis Nilsen was watching the royal wedding of Diana Spencer and Prince Charles when there was a knock on the front door. He said, "Who's there?" He assumed they were religious solicitors. The voice said, "It's your landlord, Mr. Nilsen." Dennis panicked. He thought of the body parts. Though the bags kept the flies and maggots out, the stench of decaying flesh had begun to emerge in the summer heat. Dennis. "I'm coming." Dennis ran to the bathroom to grab a can of air freshener. He sprayed the general vicinity of the floorboards before opening the door. He let the landlord in. Landlord. "Good afternoon, sir. Mr. Nilsen, may I come in?" Dennis. It's a little untidy, sir. May I ask what this is about?" Landlord. "It's quite all right. I won't invade your privacy. The reason I'm here is to inform you that we will be renovating these apartments in the near future, so I will be requiring you to vacate the property." Nilsen thought to himself, "What? No, you cannot do this to me." Dennis. But sir, this is very unexpected. I don't have another place to live." Landlord. "I understand that, Mr. Nilsen. That is why I'm giving you 2 months' notice. You only have to vacate in the first week of October. That should give you ample time to look for another flat." Dennis. "But sir, I don't have the money to relocate. These furniture moving companies charge a fortune." Landlord. "And we are more than willing to help, Mr. Nilsen. The investors have agreed on a lump sum of £1,000 for each tenant, in order to take care of any moving costs and to reimburse you for the inconvenience caused. In addition, we will let you keep the furniture that came with the apartment when you sign the lease agreement." Dennis's back was against the wall. He had no alternative but to accept the landlord's conditions. He thought to himself, "First I have to get rid of this bloody foul odor. Then I need to find a new apartment. I will burn the remains on another bonfire the week before I move out. There will be less wind around the end of September. Where the hell am I going to find time to do all this crap? It's not like I'm doing nothing at work. Damn it." He decided to skip the remainder of the royal wedding and get to work immediately. One thing Dennis learned as a chef in the army was that it isn't lean muscle meat that presents the biggest challenge to preserving animal carcasses. It is the internal organs and intestines that cause the decaying smell. He thought, the same has to apply to human bodies, his mind told him. Why haven't I thought about this earlier? He removed the floorboards once again. He took out all the packages. He rummaged through them to harvest the lungs, livers, kidneys, hearts, stomachs, and intestines. There wasn't much blood left in the Nilsen sausage factory, but the putrid odor it left behind was stomach-churning. It took him time to get all the pieces together. He had to use a kitchen knife to separate the organs from the torsos of the more recently dispatched corpses. Over the next 2 hours, Nilsen made 5 trips to Gladstone Park, which was close to his apartment. He would fill a cooler box with organs. He would dispose of them in the bushes and shrubs. The organs would eventually be eaten by stray dogs and vermin, or be absorbed into the soil as compost. September 17th, 1981. Nilsen was on his way to work when he saw a man in his early 20s slumped against a wall separating a row of apartments from the street. He was ashen and appeared to be in pain. Dennis approached him. "Dennis, good grief, are you all right?" "Young man, it's my medication. It causes my legs to weaken." "Dennis, what's your name?" Dennis pulled him up and supported him with his right arm. "Young man, I'm Malcolm Barlow." "Dennis, will you be able to walk, Malcolm?" "Malcolm, I can try." Dennis assisted the boy up to the front door of his apartment. He realized something was terribly wrong with Malcolm. His legs could barely support his body weight. His breathing was labored and uneven. He had a fever. Once inside Dennis's apartment, Dennis placed Malcolm on the sofa. "Dennis, what kind of medication are you taking?" "Malcolm, it's for my epilepsy. It inhibits the frequency of the epilepsy seizures, but sometimes it affects my nervous system, and then my legs become wobbly. It's never been this bad, though." Dennis called 999, the British equivalent of 911. The operator told him they had had similar cases with the medication Malcolm was taking. They dispatched an ambulance. While they waited for the ambulance, Malcolm told Dennis he was supposed to eat something before taking his medication, but he overslept and hadn't had time for breakfast. He also told Dennis that he was mentally disabled and receiving social assistance. The ambulance came and got Malcolm. Dennis went to work. When Dennis returned home from work on Friday, he found Malcolm Barlow sitting on the stairs in front of his doorstep. Malcolm smiled and rose to his feet. He said, "See, I'm better now. I came by to say thank you." "Dennis, would you like to come in for dinner?" Malcolm, "Sure, thanks." After having dinner with Malcolm, he made the mistake of giving him alcohol. Malcolm took his medication an hour before. After only 2 rum and cokes, he passed out on the sofa. Dennis drank in the sight of the young man sleeping on the sofa. He thought, what if he wakes up and leaves me to be on my own again? Malcolm was so out of it, he didn't even wake while Dennis strangled him to death with his bare hands. It was the easiest kill of them all. Once Malcolm was dead, Dennis deposited his body beneath the sink in the kitchen. He returned to the living room to watch television. A news report revealed that a Russian plane with 33 people on board was struck by a Soviet Army helicopter. All passengers of both aircrafts died. Dennis sipped rum as he pondered the possibilities of what a heap of 40 corpses would look like. At this point, he preferred the company of the deceased. He found these interactions far more meaningful. Nilsen built another large bonfire in his backyard. He even fed cupboard doors to the beast. He threw garbage bags full of body parts into the fire. He went to Bleep's shed in the garden to retrieve the corpse of Malcolm Barlow. He stashed it there the previous day when his landlord came knocking. Dennis dragged the cadaver to the living room and near the floorboards. He placed it on a layer of dustbin liners. He went at it with a carving knife. He was a master butcher now, dismembering Malcolm's body. Bleep was locked in the bathroom. Dennis added Malcolm's remains to the fire. He went back into the apartment to release Bleep from her confinement. He held her up to the window that faced the backyard. He said to her, "What do you think of my bonfire, Bleep? It's pretty, isn't it?" He had a beer and a cigarette as he watched the fire burn for the rest of the afternoon. 6:45 p.m. Dennis walked out to the backyard to inspect the residue of the fire. Among the ashes, cinders, and other debris were large bone splinters and 2 intact skulls. He crushed them into smaller fragments with a shovel. He was satisfied that the evidence was destroyed. He went back into the apartment. He nailed the floorboards shut. He ran himself a hot bath. As he lay in the water, he wept. He couldn't understand why he kept murdering people all the time. He had no control over this impulse. It just wouldn't stop. He was beside himself. It seemed like it was happening to another person. He asked himself, "Why, Des? Why do you keep on doing this? Why can't you just live your life like a normal person?" He was moving soon, and he was determined that with the change of address, he would put a stop to the murder and necrophilia. He said to himself, "No more murders, okay?" His confused mind told him. "No more murders, and no more of this obsession with dead bodies. You are done after today, Des Nilsen. Done." November 23rd, 1981. Dennis had lived at his new address for almost 2 months. On this day, he decided not to go to work. It was his 36th birthday. After a long breakfast and a 3-hour walk for Bleep, he went to a gay-friendly pub called the Golden Lion to have lunch. As he sipped on a pint, he praised himself for abstaining from murder and necrophilia. A very handsome young man sat down next to him at the bar. He was lean and tall. He had dark black hair and an infectious smile. The man had a look at the other men in the bar, so Dennis surmised he was gay. The bartender said to the young man, "What can I get you to drink?" "Dennis, you look like a nice enough bloke to me. Allow me to buy you a drink. I'm Des Nilsen, the Golden Lion's most loyal local customer." "Young man, Paul Nobbs. Nice to meet you, Des. And thanks for the offer. I'm a student, so I won't say no to a free drink. No, sir." Bartender, "What will it be then?" "Paul Nobbs. I'll have what he's having." Dennis, "Where do you study? I haven't seen you around here." Paul Nobbs, "At the University of London. Up the road, but I usually go to the Champion pub in Bayswater for drinks." Dennis, "What do you study?" Paul, "It's a 3-year course called Eastern European Studies. I'm in my first year now. What do you do for a living?" Dennis, "I used to be a policeman, but now I'm working for Manpower Services. That, however, is not important. What is important is that you came here as if being sent, Paul. It is my birthday today, and I have nobody to celebrate it with, except for Grumpy over there," indicating the bartender. Paul raised his glass. "Well, here's to you then, Des. Happy birthday." That was the first time someone wished Dennis a happy birthday since his grandfather died. It was sincere compared to the perfunctory sentiments he received from co-workers. It was bitterly cold, and after book shopping, they went to Dennis's apartment to have a hot meal. They ate and watched television. This led to heavy petting. They drank rum until after midnight. Being so lean, Paul got drunk in short order. He just couldn't imbibe like his host. Dennis said, "Let us get some sleep. You won't find a taxi now. It's past midnight already." Paul was hard-pressed to argue. They got into bed together. Dennis was still awake as Paul slept. He stroked his hair. The voices in Dennis's head began to pester him once again. What if he leaves you in the morning? Then you will never see this beautiful man again. Nilsen tried to resist the urge. It was futile. Before he knew it, he had one of his ties around Paul's neck, and he strangled him unconscious. Paul's drunken stupor was so deep, he didn't even wake up while Nilsen was choking him. His eyes flashed momentarily, and he made a soft moaning sound. Then he lost consciousness. Dennis pulled the tie back and dropped it on the floor. He was about to climb out of the bed to fill a bucket of water to drown Paul, when an ambassador voice of the sane intervened. "No, you're not going to kill him, Des. You're in a new place now. Do not mess this up. Stay clean this time, please." Miraculously, this worked. There was a glass of water on the bedside table. He poured the water on Paul's face. Paul woke with a start, yelping to consciousness. Once his breathing returned to normal, he turned to his side to sleep off the rest of the inebriation. Dennis sighed with relief. He lay awake for a half-hour before drifting off to a restless sleep. In the morning, Paul woke before Dennis. When Dennis woke, he sat up. Paul was looking in the mirror. He noticed Dennis was awake. He said, "What happened to me?" His voice was hoarse. "I can't remember anything about last night. At least not since after we've had supper." Dennis said, "You look bloody awful. You should see a doctor." That point was true. Paul's face was swollen. His eyes were bloodshot. He croaked out every word. Dennis regretted everything he did to Paul. The only reassurance came from knowing that Paul was still alive. Dennis now perceived himself as a, quote, recovering serial murderer, end quote. After seeing Paul off, Dennis said to Bleep, "See, everything is going to be okay, Bleep. We can live a normal life. Everything is going to be okay." March 1982. Dennis Nilsen met John Howlett at a gay-friendly pub called the Coleherne. At this time, Nilsen mostly kept to himself during the day and spent most of his nights at a pub. He had 3 goals in mind: getting a promotion at work, finding a boyfriend, and providing the best possible care for Bleep. He was promised he would receive a promotion in June. His relationship with Bleep grew stronger. He still wanted a long-term relationship with a man, and this eluded him for some time. Dennis lured John Howlett to his apartment. He poured whiskey for them both. They watched television together. They watched the James Bond film For Your Eyes Only. After debating the merits of all the actors who played Bond throughout the years, Howlett said to Nilsen, "Listen, Dennis, I'm not feeling too well. Do you mind if I lie down in the room for an hour or so?" Dennis said, "Be my guest. I'll wake you in an hour." The truth was, Dennis was angered by this. He didn't bring John to his home so he could sit and watch TV alone. He hated watching television by himself. Bleep wasn't sufficient company for something like a movie. Dennis continued to drink. He knew what could transpire if he took it too far, but he was reaching the point of no return. The urge to extinguish the fires of life within Johnny was too strong to be denied. Dennis's knuckles were digging into the armchair's cushion. His knuckles turned white. He felt an upholstery strap underneath the cushion. He ripped it off and ran to the bedroom. He wrapped the upholstery strap around John's neck. An aggressive struggle ensued. The more Dennis strangled him, the stronger he seemed to become. He kicked and growled. His grip on John's throat was so strong that Dennis came to believe he was going to be the victim instead of the killer. When he let go, the body went limp under Dennis's weight. Nilsen shouted, "Holy shit!" His hands were shaking. His throat was burning. John nearly overpowered him. Howlett began to stir again. Dennis struck him with the upholstery strap so hard into his neck that his skull hit the headrest of the bed. Blood was gushing out of a large gash in the back of John's head. He stopped breathing again. Dennis collapsed onto John. He was exhausted. Nilsen realized John's heart was still beating. He kept the strap around John's neck with his right hand. He dragged him to the bathroom. He fumbled with both taps with his left hand. Blood was dripping all over the place. Dennis hated it. Blood made him nauseous. After filling the tub, he pushed John's head in the water as far as it would go. John wasn't struggling, but Nilsen didn't want to take any chances. 4 minutes later, John died from drowning. Dennis left him in the tub. He looked at himself in the mirror. There were red finger marks around his neck. There were scratch marks beneath his eyes and on his temples. He said to his reflection, "What the fuck have you done, Dennis? You almost got yourself killed, you dumb bastard. And what about your promise to not murder anyone again? Huh? What about that, you sick son of a bitch?" He was disgusted with himself. He looked back at John's body. It occurred to him that he was faced with a problem he didn't have at his last address. There were no floorboards to pry open and no garden. He asked himself, horrified. How the hell am I going to get rid of the body? John Howlett's corpse remained in the bathtub for 3 days. He was fully dressed. Dennis was able to function at work, but he would return to the bathroom in the evening. He would glare at the bloated corpse while giving himself a sponge bath. By the time Friday rolled around, he had come up with a plan to dispose of the body. In the evening, he removed all his clothes and attended to the matter. He removed all the clothing from Howlett's body. He used a large carving knife to cut off his head. He took a large pasta pot and filled it halfway with water. He put John's head in and boiled it on the stove. As the head boiled, he went back to the bathroom. He split the torso open from the neck to the navel with the carving knife. He removed the internal organs. Using a sharp chopping knife, he sliced all the organs and intestines into smaller portions on a wooden cutting board. He rolled the pieces into balls the size of peaches. He covered them in toilet paper and flushed them down the toilet one by one. It was tedious. It took over 3 hours. By 11 p.m., he had flushed his toilet 85 times. He was lightheaded and weary. After a cigarette break, he used a serrated bread knife to saw off the hands and feet. He sliced as much meat from the bones as he could with the chopping knife. He crushed the phalanges. He flushed the hunks of flesh and fragments of bone down the toilet. He repeated this task over and over into the wee hours of the morning. When he went to bed at 3 a.m., John Howlett's head was still boiling. All that was left of the corpse was the torso and the legs. The next morning, Nilsen got up at 9 a.m. He went to a hardware store and bought 4 pounds of lime powder and a roll of heavy-duty trash bags. When he returned home, he dismembered the legs. He placed them in a garbage bag with the torso. He poured lime powder on them and sealed the bag. All that remained of the head after all the hours of boiling was a skull. He placed it in another trash bag. He stored the bags in one of the unused wardrobes in his bedroom. He poured the meat-filled liquid in the pasta pot down the drain. He cleaned the bathtub and bathroom floor with bleach. He took Bleep for a walk. He felt relieved, feeling that after all the trouble he went to, nobody would suspect him of doing what he had done. Still, he didn't know how much longer that situation would last. He was addicted to murder. There was no way to predict who the next victim was going to be and when he would meet them. Carl Stodder considered himself to be one of the friendliest men in London. He was 21 years old. He had long blonde hair and tender facial features. He was flamboyant and performed as a revue artist. His stage name was Cara LaFox. He was openly gay. Carl Stodder met Dennis Nilsen in May 1982. They became acquainted in a pub called the Black Cap. He looked glum. Dennis, why do you look so depressed? You're just about the sexiest man I have ever met, and it's really sad to see you with that worried look in your eyes. Carl, my boyfriend dumped me yesterday. Dennis, I'm sorry to hear about that. Were you close? Carl, very close. Used to attend all my drag queen performances, always bringing along a bunch of flowers, and then he just suddenly stopped about a week ago. When I confronted him about it yesterday, he broke out in tears and told me there was someone else, and that he didn't love me anymore. That totally blew my mind, and my heart was so shattered I couldn't sleep last night. I finally took 2 sleeping pills and crashed at 4 o'clock this morning. Now everything is dull inside, and I'm trying to process the miserable fact that I'm single after all these years. Dennis, well, Carl, if it will make you feel any better, I've been single all my life. Carl, really? You've been gay your whole life, and you've never had a boyfriend? Like ever? Dennis, what can I say? I guess I'm the unluckiest guy in the whole of England. The only campaign I've ever had is Bleep. Carl, Bleep? Dennis, my collie dog. We're the best of mates. Have always been, will always be. Carl, I'd love to meet Bleep. It's such an adorable name. Just over 40 minutes later, they were in Dennis's living room. They had a few drinks. Bleep was curled up on the carpet as they watched television together. The windows were up, but Carl could smell something strange. He didn't say anything about it, but he thought to himself, it smells like old lamb stew mixed with bleach or oven cleaner. They drank and talked until shortly past 10 o'clock. Carl couldn't keep his eyes open anymore. He had only slept for 3 hours the previous day. Dennis suggested they go to bed together. Carl said, no, please, I don't know if I'm ready for another relationship just yet. Would you mind if I rather slept on the sofa? Dennis said, not at all. He brought him a sleeping bag from his bedroom. He laid it out for him on the sofa. He said, Bleep will watch over you. And please mind the zipper on the sleeping bag. It's kind of broken and quite tricky to open once it's zipped shut. Carl fell asleep. He was wearing only his pink underwear. He woke in the middle of the night in terror. He was suffocating. It felt like the sleeping bag was strangling him. The zipper was biting into his throat. Carl thought Dennis was trying to help him when he heard him say, stay still, Carl. Carl blacked out. When Carl woke, he was in a bathtub that was filled with cold water. The water was still running. His vision was blurred. He was about to take a deep breath when a hand submerged his head in the water. He lurched upward in a panic. Somehow he managed to free his head from the vice-like grip. The hand pressed down again. Carl freed himself from the grip a second time. He inhaled and screamed, no more, please, no more. The hand pressed down again as he was about to take another deep breath. He blacked out again. He woke again. This time Bleep was licking his face. Somebody's hands were massaging his chest. When he opened his eyes, daylight poured through the windows. He sat in an armchair. He was wearing a red tracksuit that did not belong to him. A brown blanket had been placed on his knees. Carl, what happened? Dennis, oh, Carl, you had a nightmare and then you got tangled up in the sleeping bag and nearly suffocated to death. Carl put his hands to his neck. Carl, yes, I remember that, but why did you try to drown me? Dennis, no, you were in shock, and I was trying to revive your blood circulation. That's why I put you in the cold water. Then you lost consciousness again, and I dressed you and rubbed your limbs and heart to bring you back to life. Dennis embraced Carl. Dennis, I'm so glad you're alive. I was worried sick about you, man. Dennis thought to himself, so far so good. I have saved 2 and killed only 1. Paul Nobbs and Carl Stoddard were lucky. Johnny Howlett pulled the short straw, but that was his own fault. He abandoned me for no other reason than, quote, not feeling too well, end quote. Dennis wasn't happy at his new address. Many evenings he would arrive home feeling crestfallen after failing to solicit vulnerable young men. He would masturbate in bed, fantasizing about the men he killed and defiled post-mortem. All 9 of them. He flinched when he recalled boiling Johnny Howlett's head and flushing his internal organs down the toilet like it was medical waste. He still kept Johnny's torso and legs in trash bags that he kept in a wardrobe. He would add more lime powder every other week to decelerate decomposition. In June, he was promoted to the position of executive officer. He was transferred to another part of the city. September 1982, Graham Allen stumbled down Shaftesbury Avenue, drunk and high. He spent all his money at the pub, which left him nothing for transportation. He figured there was no harm in asking a taxi for hire if they would drive him. The worst thing they could do was say no. As he approached the taxis, a man rushed across the street and grabbed him by the arm. He said, "Sir, are you all right? You look drowsy." Graham said, "I'm drunk and I'm high. Leave me alone." The man asked him, "What's your name?" "Graham." "Look, Graham, I'm Dennis, and if you want to, you can come back to my place for drinks, something to eat, and a warm bed. What do you say? I'll even pay for your taxi ride." Graham: "Thank you, but why on earth would you do that? You don't know me from a bar of soap." Dennis: "I work for Manpower Services. It's my job to look after homeless people." Graham: "I'm not homeless." Graham trailed off. They departed for Dennis's apartment. Dennis fixed Graham an omelet, for which Graham was grateful. Graham nodded off in the middle of eating. He still had food in his mouth as he slept. Dennis poured himself a drink. He removed his necktie and strangled Graham. 3 minutes later, Graham was dead. Dennis was surprised by how easy it was. The voices in Dennis's head didn't hold Graham in high regard. He didn't even put up a struggle, the useless bastard. What an excuse for a human being. Oxygen thief. Once Graham's heart stopped beating, Dennis released the tie from his neck. He undressed Graham. He laid the naked corpse out on the floor. With his penis in one hand and Graham's in the other, he masturbated. After climaxing, he brought the corpse to the bathroom. He washed it and left it in the tub, where it remained for 3 days. Friday night, Dennis removed his own clothes until he was naked. He removed the corpse from the bathtub. He laid out 2 garbage bags on the bathroom floor. He positioned the cadaver on them. He went to work dissecting it into components. He cut off Graham's head and boiled it in a large cooking pot on the stove. He cut off the hands and feet. He diced the flesh and flushed it down the toilet. He did the same with the internal organs. He severed the body at the waist. This time he didn't bother severing the arms. It would have taken too long. He put Graham's torso in a black trash bag. He threw in 2 pounds of lime powder. Dennis stored it next to John Hallett's remains in the wardrobe. The legs were put in a separate bag. They were kept in a tea chest in the living room. After all the flesh and facial hair was boiled from the head, he put the skull in a bag. This was kept in the wardrobe. He finished all this work at 4 a.m. Dennis ran a hot bath and cleansed his body. He thought, "You simply cannot stop this, can you? It might be time to turn yourself into the police, Des. You're a dysfunctional man." When he got out of the bath, he caught a glimpse of himself in the mirror. He had lost weight. He was looking gaunt. He thought, "Stressful to be a serial killer, isn't it?" January 1983. No matter how much lime powder was tossed into the trash bags, the flesh continued to decompose, and the stench of death permeated the air of Dennis Nilsen's apartment. If you have read Edgar Allan Poe's short story, The Beating of the Telltale Heart, you would know from these developments that the sound of the telltale heart's pounding was deafening to Dennis Nilsen. Secrets and lies are the products of artifice, and at times they can barely stand on the flimsy infrastructure with which they have been constructed. The truth becomes more and more deeply rooted and solidifies like oak. The dead men who met their end in Dennis Nilsen's apartment couldn't speak with their voices, but the stench of their rotten flesh was screaming in competition with the voices in Nilsen's head, and at times they were drowning them out. Just because Dennis Nilsen wasn't in prison didn't mean he was a free man. There was no way to escape what he had done to these men. He bought a dozen air freshener cans. He sprayed half of them in the wardrobe and left the empty cans on the bags. It disguised the stench partially, but the odor remained. Dennis thought, "Oh well, that's as good as it's going to get." January 26th. When he returned from work, Dennis was accosted by a female senior who lived in another unit. She said, "You were Dennis Nilsen, right? The one in the attic flat?" Dennis stuttered. Yes, ma'am." She said, "What's that smell coming from your place?" Dennis said, "Oh, it's just mold. I've been trying to get rid of it, but with all this rain, it's difficult with the moisture levels, you know?" She said, "That doesn't smell like mold to me, young man. I have been around long enough to know the smell of mold. That odor coming from your place smells like you're cooking venison stew and leaving it in the pot for weeks." Dennis said, "I can assure you that is not the case, ma'am. I'm real sorry about the smell. I have no idea why it stinks like that, but I will ask the landlord to come and take a look at the problem, all right?" She said, "Very well then. You have yourself a good evening now, see?" Dennis said, "You too, ma'am." He went into his apartment. He thought to himself, "What am I going to do? Other people are also going to start to complain about the smell if I don't get rid of it soon. Damn it!" He sprayed more air freshener in the wardrobe and opened all the windows. He went out to a pub called the Royal George for a meal and a few pints. He sat alone and contemplated what had become of his life. The thought of turning himself into the police crossed his mind often at that time. After the confrontation with the elderly woman, he was even more determined to put a stop to the killing spree. The problem was that homicidal part of him seemed to have a mind of its own. It used Dennis Nilsen's body like it was a marionette. The silence was pierced by a query. "Hello there." When Dennis looked up, he saw a very handsome young man. Dennis said, "Hello back at you. Can I help you with anything?" The young man said, "I'm Stephen. Do you mind if I sit down?" Dennis, "Not at all. I'm Dennis Nilsen." "Stephen?" "Stephen. Sinclair. But I was actually born Stephen Neil Guild. My biological parents rejected me, and then I was adopted by the Sinclairs when I was 2 years old. They threw me out when I was 13 and handed me over to social services." Dennis, "So what can I do for you, Stephen Sinclair?" Stephen, "This is kind of embarrassing, but I haven't eaten all day and I have no money left. Would you be so kind as to buy me a portion of fish and chips?" Dennis, "Where do you live?" Stephen, "I don't actually have a permanent place. I stay in Salvation Army youth hostels whenever I can find one with an open space for me." Dennis, "Why don't you come back to my place? It's in Muswell Hill, on Cranley Gardens Street, and much warmer than in here. I was on my way out in any event. I don't have much in the kitchen this late in the month, but I can buy you a burger or something on the way there." They left and departed for Dennis's place. On the way, Dennis bought Stephen a Big Mac. When they arrived at Dennis's apartment, Dennis was embarrassed by what he brought his guest home to. The kitchen was messy. The furniture was old and derelict. The smell of death and decay hung thick in the air, despite all the open windows. Dennis, "Pardon the smell. I don't know what kind of mold it is, but it smells like a rat or something died in here." He sprayed some air freshener in the living room. He switched on the electric fireplace in the bedroom. Dennis, "This will heat the place up in no time." Stephen, "Anything's better than living on the streets. This is luxury to me, especially in winter. Last night I had to sleep on a bench in Goslet Yard. Nearly froze my balls off." Dennis, "Switch on the telly. Make yourself comfortable." Stephen, "Thank you." Dennis, "Rum or whiskey?" Dennis removed his necktie and dropped it into a brass bowl on the kitchen table. Stephen, "I'll have a whiskey. Cheers." They watched television together for a while. At one point, Stephen excused himself to go to the bathroom. He shot heroin and returned to the living room. He passed out in the armchair soon after. Dennis had a few more drinks and listened to music with the headphones. Sometime after 11 p.m., he rose to his feet. He approached Stephen. He touched his upper leg and whispered, "Stephen, are you awake?" Stephen was unresponsive. Dennis thought, "Oh man, here we go again." His heart was pounding. He said to himself, "All that beauty, all that potential, and yet You have to suffer from the pain of being a heroin addict. He checked Stephen's vital signs. He was out cold. Dennis went into the kitchen and returned with his necktie. It was tied into a fisherman's knot. He removed the scarf Stephen had been wearing. He knelt beside the chair. He took a deep breath. He moved the necktie into position around Stephen's throat. He pulled it tightly. It seemed to take forever. Stephen woke, but he was so weakened from the effects of the heroin that he was unable to defend himself. His hands went up to his throat briefly, but he couldn't summon any more energy to follow through. He stopped breathing soon after. His heartbeat got slower, until it came to a complete stop. Assured that he was dead, Dennis began to undress him. He noticed that the front of his jeans was soaked with urine. When he took off his jacket, he saw that Stephen's wrists were covered with dirty crepe bandages. He removed the bandages. There were deep razor slash marks on his wrists. Dennis said to Stephen's corpse, "See, I rescued you from a nightmare. You were beyond redemption, dear Stephen, but everything is going to be all right now. You'll see." The voices in Dennis's head told him, "This is one too many, Des. Why couldn't you just leave him alone?" It was his decision to become a drug addict, not yours. Why did you have to kill him? 3 minutes later, Dennis studied the corpse as he smoked a cigarette. He admired the beauty of Stephen's lifeless body. He picked him up and took him to the bathroom. He washed him in the tub with soap and water. Once the bath was finished, he dried the corpse off and took him to his bedroom. He put it on top of the bed. Dennis removed his clothing and lay down beside Stephen's remains. Dennis noticed in the mirror that Stephen's skin was much paler than his. Dennis applied some talcum powder to his skin to achieve a fairer complexion. He got back into bed and spooned with the corpse. He stared at their nude bodies in the mirror contentedly for a few minutes. He intended to masturbate, but he couldn't achieve an erection. The stench of death in the room negated any possibility of sexual arousal. He was still able to enjoy the tactile sensation of having someone else's soft skin against his own. He enjoyed having someone around for company. He switched the lamp off. He pulled the blankets over them. He hugged the corpse to him tightly. He turned his head toward him. He kissed the cold skin of his forehead. He said, "Good night, Stephen. Sleep tight. I'll see you in the morning, okay?" He went to sleep with his 12th victim as a teddy bear of sorts. Dennis Nilsen spent the last week of January 1983 dissecting Stephen Sinclair in the bathroom. The problem was, he was running out of space, and again there was no backyard in which to make a bonfire. While Stephen's skull was boiling on the stove, Dennis carved pieces off the torso. He drank rum, smoked cigarettes, and cried. He said to himself, "Why can't you stop this stupid act of strangling people?" He glared at the many pieces of Stephen Sinclair. The severed legs, the torso that was now cut in half below the rib cage. He continued to admonish himself. "You are such a dumb son of a bitch, Des. Look at this utter mess now. Where the hell are you going to put all these body parts?" There was some room left in the tea chest in the living room. He wrapped the upper torso with the arms intact in newsprint. He crammed it in. The lid would barely close. Dennis had to sit on it to force it shut. He returned to the bathroom, where the lower part of the torso and bulky legs awaited storage or disposal. The wardrobe was too full to allow more severed body parts. The kitchen cabinets were too small to accommodate the size of the legs and pelvis. He suddenly discovered a large drawer beneath the bathtub, reminiscent of the drawers mortuary employees use to store cadavers. He put the legs and pelvis in the drawer and shut it. He raced to the toilet and vomited. He scrubbed the floor of the bathroom with bleach. He took a long bath to cleanse himself. Stephen Sinclair's head continued to boil on the stove. He took Bleep for a walk. He pondered what to do about Stephen's skull. He suddenly remembered that there was a soccer ball inside the tea chest. He could remove the ball and replace it with a skull. He put it in there after returning home. He punctuated this act by spraying the interior of the chest with air freshener. February 4th, 1983. A shroud of misfortune was drawn over Dennis Nilsen's life like never before. One of his neighbors, a woman, approached him when he arrived home. Neighbor, are you also experiencing problems with your lavatory? Dennis, not that I know of. Dennis began to bite his fingernails. Dennis, why? Neighbor, ours doesn't want to flush. I don't know if there's a burst pipe somewhere or whether it has something to do with the strike. She was referring to the water workers' strike going on in London at the time. Dennis, since when have you had the issue? Neighbor, last night it was still working, but this morning it appeared to be blocked. He told her he would check on his toilet right away. He dashed up the stairs. He sat at his kitchen table later and said to Bleep, Listen, girl, if all the other residents are experiencing problems with the drainage system and we are not, the landlord might come up here for an inspection. We have to make a plan. Better safe than sorry, right? He wrote a letter to the landlord about the plumbing issue. The landlord assured him plumbers would resolve the issue in a few days. In the meantime, Dennis Nilsen's plumbing worked perfectly well. It was his neighbors who dealt with the clogged pipes. February 8th, 1983. The plumber arrived at the apartment complex. He opened a drain cover by the side of the house. He descended the 12-foot shaft. He came upon the blockage. Normally the drain would be plugged up with things like hair and non-flushable paper products. This was something entirely different. There was a blob of rotting flesh and small bones. The stench was so abhorrent he couldn't bear it, and this is a man who was used to working with pipes that connected directly to the sewage system. He was so alarmed he reported the findings to his supervisor. Since he arrived at dusk, they agreed to investigate further in the morning. Before he left, the plumber spoke with the tenants about what he found. When he explained to Dennis Nilsen that what he saw resembled human remains, Dennis said, It looks to me like someone has been flushing down their Kentucky Fried Chicken. The plumber asked all the tenants that congregated, Did any of you flush dog meat down the drain? The other tenants shook their heads. Dennis said, I have a dog, but she feeds on tinned meat. How are you going to clear this mess? The plumber said, We have a special plumbing suction machine, but we will only be able to do it tomorrow morning. Dennis was very nervous now. The threat of exposure was in the realm of possibility. He formulated a plan to buy some chicken from KFC and replace the meat in the drain with it. But the restaurant was already closed. After the strike of midnight, he went out with a flashlight and a plastic bag. He plucked all the pieces of flesh he could find from the manhole. He placed them in the bag. He dumped the bag behind the back garden hedge. Unbeknownst to him, one of his next-door neighbors was observing his movements through her window. There was no time to get rid of the body parts in his apartment. He went to bed at 1 a.m., hoping for the best. He became introspective. He didn't want to go to prison, but the life he was living was too much to bear. He said to himself, If they catch me, they catch me. I've had enough. I cannot take this anymore. He contemplated suicide. He didn't have the means to do it, or at least none he had the stomach for. He asked Bleep rhetorically who was going to look after her after he was gone. February 9th. The plumber returned at 7:30 a.m. Dennis had left for work. The plumber discovered that someone had cleared the drain. This struck him as suspicious. He informed his supervisor and he contacted the police. While the police were en route, the plumber discovered some hunks of flesh and 4 small bones in a pipe. This pipe led from the drain that linked to the top floor of the house, where Dennis lived. He looked at the bones closely. They looked like they came from a human being's hand. When the police examined the scene, they found even more flesh and bones, though they weren't immediately sure whether they were of human or animal origin. What they did know was that it all came from the attic's drain. The remains were taken to a mortuary. A pathologist concluded after running some tests that the flesh was of human origin. A few minutes before he left work, Dennis Nilsen said something to a colleague that they must have found puzzling. "If I'm not in tomorrow, I am either ill, dead, or in jail." He knew he wouldn't be the slightest bit surprised if the police were waiting for him at home. Sure enough, when he arrived at the apartment complex, there were 2 police vehicles parked behind the plumber's van. A detective and 2 other officers were waiting outside the entrance to the building. Dennis approached them. "Detective, Mr. Nilsen?" Dennis: "Yes, that's me." "Detective, we have come to question you about the drain blockage in the building." Dennis: "Why would a policeman concern himself with drains? Are they health inspectors?" Detective: "No, Mr. Nilsen, they are not health inspectors. They are also police officers. Will you escort us up to your flat in order for us to discuss the matter further?" Nilsen led them up to his apartment. When they walked in, they found that it was as freezing cold as it was outside. The windows were wide open. Despite all the fresh air, everyone could smell the putrid stench of rotten flesh. Dennis: "Sir, you haven't told me why the police would be interested in my drains." Detective: "Mr. Nilsen, the building's drains are blocked with human remains." Dennis: "Good grief, how awful. Where did it come from?" Detective: "From your flat, Mr. Nilsen. I'm sure I don't have to tell you anything about that." Dennis: "No, you're right, Detective. You don't have to." Detective: "Don't mess about, Nilsen. Where is the rest of the body?" Dennis: "In 2 plastic bags in that wardrobe." One of the other officers asked him, "Is there anything else you want to tell us?" Dennis said, "It's a long story. It goes back a long time. I will tell you everything. It just sort of happened. I want to get off my chest, but not here, at the police station." The detective put on a pair of latex gloves and inspected the human remains Dennis Nilsen kept in storage. He returned and said to Dennis, gasping, glaring, "What the hell?" Solemnly, Dennis said, "I know." He put Bleep down on the floor from his lap. He got up and put his hands behind his back. The detective put handcuffs on his wrists. He said, "Dennis Andrew Nilsen, I am hereby arresting you on suspicion of murder. You will now come with us to Hornsey Police Station, where your rights will be explained to you and where you will be interrogated by a team of police investigators. Do you understand?" Dennis nodded his acknowledgement. He said, "Will you please arrange for someone to look after my dog while I'm at the station?" One of the officers picked up the dog, covered her in a blanket, and took her outside. Once he was in the back seat of the police car, the detective said, "The human remains in your flat. How many bodies are we talking about? 2 or 3? Dennis was sweating profusely. He said, 3, but it's much worse than that. Probably more than a dozen since 1978. I will tell you everything. You know, if you haven't caught me today, it would have most likely ended in hundreds of bodies." Dennis didn't hear the detective's next response. Dennis was too busy admonishing himself in his head. He thought to himself, "Only you screwed up your life, Des Nilsen, not Grandpa, not the boy who saved you from drowning, and not the Arab taxi driver who tried to kill you in Yemen. You did this all to yourself. You've become addicted to killing people, and you know what? It is too late for remorse now. You need to pay for your sins, you sick psychopath. It continued as the car rolled into the police station's parking lot. Where would young Stephen Holmes be today if you haven't ripped the life from his body, Des? And what about the aspiring Kenneth Ogden or Johnny Howlett? You have aimlessly ended these people's lives without thinking what they could have achieved, you son of a bitch. This dialogue is extracted from the interrogation record. Police, you assured us that you would tell us everything about your crimes, so please go ahead. Dennis, where do you want me to begin? Police, explain to us about the dismembered body parts and your flat at Cranley Gardens. Dennis, how do you mean? In what context? Police, well, how the body parts came to be there. Dennis, did you search the rest of the flat? Police, why? Dennis, there are some more human remains in my tea chest in the lounge and in the drawer under the bath. Both the officers flinched. Nilsen confessed to killing a dozen men, including the ones he murdered at his previous address. He even admitted to the attempted murders. He showed no remorse, but he was very cooperative in terms of giving up information. Police, Mr. Nilsen, help us to understand this, please. Tell us what started you off in 1978. Dennis, you know, that is something I have never stopped asking myself. There is no disputing the fact that I am a violent killer under certain circumstances. I know it would have been better if my reason for killing was sex, bloodlust, or sadism, but it is none of these. I was hoping you would be able to tell me why I did it. Police, why didn't you stop after the first victim? Dennis, I don't know. Police, did you deliberately lure young men to your home to kill them? Dennis, what do you want me to say? Police, did you intend to kill all of these people, Mr. Nilsen? Dennis, what I did seemed right at the time. Police, wait, are you saying that you've had a need to kill? Dennis, in some cases, at that precise moment of the act, I felt my sole reason for existence was to carry out the act. Killing others gave me a reason to live. There's no other way to explain it. It just happened. Police, unbelievable. The detective shuddered. The police were presented with a problem. Normally a body is found, and the investigation begins with that discovery as a starting point. In this case, they had to search for the other bodies. The police returned to Cranley Gardens to retrieve the last of the remains Nilsen kept in his apartment. Nilsen accompanied them to his previous address on Melrose Avenue. He told them about the bonfires and where he burned them. One of the officers asked him, "How many people did you burn on these so-called bonfires?" Dennis, on the first fire, only one, Stevie, but the other two were genuine bonfires, big ones. Probably another 9 to 12 bodies. I can't be sure. Officer, you can't be sure? What does that mean? Dennis, it means exactly what I told you, sir, that I'm not sure how many people's lives I took during the time span of 5 years. Officer, you arrogant bastard. Over the next 36 hours, police found over 1,000 human bone fragments behind the property. Most of them were blackened from the fire. Under British law, the police have only 48 hours to charge someone, or else they have to release them. With the assistance of a pathologist, Stephen Sinclair's remains were positively identified. Dennis Nilsen was charged with his murder. Journalists later dubbed Dennis Nilsen the British Jeffrey Dahmer. When he was asked about whether he felt any remorse about the crimes he committed, he said, "I wished I could stop, but I just couldn't. I had no other thrill or happiness in life." He said he took no pleasure from the act of killing, but he did say he, quote, worshipped the art and the act of death, end quote. The following is a self-appraisal Nilsen wrote while he awaited trial in prison. I am not trained to interpret the workings of the mind and its effect upon personality and actions. With lay experience, my personal conclusions flow from what are only some unofficial guesstimates. The experts do not know me as I know myself. I have felt that since my teenage years that I have been a creative psychopath. Since I have committed 15 killings and probably 8 attempted killings, I feel able to go further on this self-assessment. In times of acute emotional pressure and under the triggering influence of spirits, i.e. alcohol, usually dormant mental forces have been released, which have made mine the actions of a destructive psychopath. These two conditions are not strictly mental illness. They seem to me more acceptable in law as gross personal defects. I felt an overwhelming desire to kill, in cases I remember. The strong moral side of my character should have produced the strength and power to resist this. It may be that the conditions which existed at that time and the pressures are now gone, but I cannot allow the buck to travel outside my personality. Being a practiced public servant for 23 years makes it difficult to display the weakness of open emotion. My victims are still causing emotional pain to their surviving relatives. In my actions, I can't look back, only forward. I deserve punishment for their deaths. I feared the inevitable punishment from the start. I am the cold light of day. I knew that I had committed a grievous crime. I could not handle the feeling of horror and shame. Afterwards, I managed to suppress all thoughts of morality. In my mind, I would make my peace and my feelings of genuine remorse with the body. I felt they would have forgiven me as they lay at peace. I never had any feeling of wanting to cause pain. I would abhor having to disfigure the body by the necessary act of dissection. The greater the beauty, in my estimation, of the man, the greater was the sense of loss and grief. Their dead, naked bodies fascinated me, but I would have done anything to have them back alive. In at least 3 of the attempts, I managed to revive them and felt like I had actually saved their lives. These successes brought great happiness to me. I could not understand why I had apparently tried to kill them in the first place. I was not actually horrified at the dead bodies, but I was disgusted with my own body, that it was not dead also. I visualized my body lying dead on a mortuary slab. I thought that death might give us what life could not, and it would be forever. Right now, I feel I'm able to enjoy a sexual relationship with an attractive male or female. I am perhaps now under no pressure. As an ordinary prisoner, nobody now expects anything of me. I have no further need of medicinal booze. My mental state now is better than in the last few years. In many respects, I have escaped from out there to in here. Des Nilsen. Bleep could not find a loving home. Nobody wanted to adopt a serial killer's dog. She was euthanized a few days after Nilsen's arrest. Indirectly, she was his final victim. Nilsen was not always well behaved in prison. He was disciplined for an incident in which he threw the contents of his chamber pot out of his cell. Nilsen didn't stand a chance at the trial. There was his confession from the police interrogation. Witnesses who narrowly avoided being killed by him testified about the experience. Nilsen even drew pictures of the things he did to the victims' bodies for the police. November 4th, 1983. After deliberating, the jury returned with a verdict. Guilty on all 6 charges of murder and 2 charges of attempted murder. Dennis Nilsen was sentenced to life in prison with a 25-year tariff. Under British law, that meant he would only be able to apply for parole after serving 25 years. He was sent to Wormwood Scrubs, which had a reputation for being one of the worst prisons in England. On the way out of the building that housed the courts, a journalist asked Nilsen, "What is your response in regards to your life sentence?" Dennis said, "For me to be receiving any kind of sentence, I have to be alive. That is twice as much as what my victims have. They are all dead, and it's my fault. While at Wormwood Scrubs, Dennis made a pass at another inmate. When it was not favorably received, he attacked the man. In self-defense, the other man slashed him with a razor. Nilsen received 85 stitches in his left cheek. He was transferred to Parkhurst Prison. He was a target at all the prisons he lived in. While at Full Sutton Prison, he was moved to a vulnerable prisoner unit. Nilsen reflected on his crimes in a television interview in 1992. In the end, when there were 2 or 3 bodies under the floorboards, he told the reporter, and it became summer, it got hot, and then there would be a smell problem. I thought, what would cause the smell more than anything else? Then I came to the conclusion that it was the soft parts of the bodies, the organs. So, on a weekend, I would pull up the floorboards, blinding drunk because I found it totally unpleasant, and start dissection on the floor. The journalist said, "What sort of preparation would you have to make for that?" Dennis said, "Well, these plastic bags, the dustbin liners, you just split one of those so that it forms kind of a sheet. Then you put the body on the sheet and then cut it up." While incarcerated, Nilsen wrote an autobiography. This is one passage. "When I was with people, I was in the real world, and in my private life, I snapped instantly into my fantasy life. I could oscillate between the two with instant ease." He blamed alcoholism and a deranged emotional state for his homicidal urges. It was never published. Prison officials confiscated the work and submitted it to police. Nilsen appealed to the European Court of Human Rights, feeling that his own were violated. May 10th, 2018. Dennis Andrew Nilsen died from complications of a blood clot. He was 72 years old. Thank you for listening to Human Monsters. Bye for now.